The silver bullet lay on the rough-hewn table, its once gleaming surface now dulled by time and touched by the flickering amber light of the oil lamp. Beside it, a crumpled letter, its edges worn soft from countless readings, and a tarnished sheriff's badge, its star barely visible beneath years of neglect. Outside, rain began to tap against the cabin's tin roof, a gentle prelude to the coming storm. Mason Calloway's weathered hand moved slowly across the table, fingers tracing the outline of the bullet without touching it. The deep scar that ran the length of his left cheek seemed to darken in the lamp's unsteady light, pulling tight against his skin as his jaw clenched. 15 years had passed, yet the weight of that single bullet remained unchanged, a small piece of metal that had altered the course of so many lives, including his own. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Mason's eyes flickered toward the window. He could see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, slate gray and heavy with promise. His cattle had already begun to gather near the eastern fence line, a sure sign this would be no ordinary squall. The animals always knew. Perhaps they could sense the pressure dropping, feel it in their bones, the way Mason felt the coming rain in his old bullet wounds. "Going to be a long night," he murmured to the empty room, his voice rough from disuse. At 58, Mason had grown accustomed to the silence of his isolated homestead on the Arizona frontier. He'd chosen this plot of land precisely for its remoteness, far from Silver Creek, far from civilization, far from memories that still haunted him, despite 15 years of running. Here days could pass without him speaking a single word aloud. The sudden knock at his door came like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Mason froze his hand instinctively, moving to the revolver at his hip. Visitors were rare out here, especially with a storm brewing. He'd chosen this place for that very reason, 20 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding trail that disappeared entirely during the rainy season. Another knock, more insistent this time. He rose slowly from his chair, decades of caution governing his movements. Years as a lawman had taught him that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news, and years in exile had taught him that some grudges never died. "Who's there?" he called, positioning himself to the side of the door, hand still resting on his gun. "Please," came a woman's voice, clear despite the growing wind. "We need shelter from the storm." Mason hesitated. There was something in that voice, an accent perhaps, or a particular cadence that tugged at his memory. "There's a town 20 miles south," he replied, making no move to open the door. "Junction City has a proper hotel." "We will not make it there before the storm breaks," the voice answered. "My sister is injured. We ask only for shelter until morning." Mason's eyes narrowed. 2 women, 1 injured, caught in the approaching tempest. It could be exactly as they claimed, travelers in need of assistance. Or it could be a trap. It wouldn't be the first time someone had used a woman's voice to lower a man's guard. Lightning split the sky briefly, illuminating the cabin through its single window. Thunder followed almost immediately. The storm was nearly upon them. Mason made his decision and stepped forward, unbolting the door, but keeping his right hand close to his weapon. The door swung open to reveal 2 Native American women standing on his porch. Apache Mason recognized immediately, though he kept his face carefully neutral. The older woman stood tall despite the evident fatigue in her bearing, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. The younger leaned against the porch post, clearly favoring her left leg, her face drawn with pain. "Thank you," the older woman said, meeting Mason's gaze directly. "I am Elena. This is my sister Nara." Mason stepped back, allowing them entry but not holstering his weapon. "Mason Calloway," he offered, watching, as Elena helped her sister to a chair near the fire. "What happened to her leg?" A fall from her horse yesterday, Elena replied, her hands gentle as she helped Nara sit. The trail became treacherous in the dark. Mason noticed how Elena positioned herself between him and her sister, protective, wary. These women were no strangers to danger. "Storm's going to last through the night," he said, moving to add wood to the fire. "You can rest here, but I expect you'll be gone by morning." "Of course," Elena nodded, though something in her tone suggested she had no intention of departing so quickly. As Mason stoked the fire, he could feel their eyes on him, studying him with an intensity that made the scar on his cheek burn. They hadn't come here by accident. No one stumbled upon his remote cabin without purpose. "I have some dried meat and beans." He offered more to break the uncomfortable silence than from any sense of hospitality. "Not much, but it'll fill your bellies." "You are kind," Elena replied, though her expression remained guarded. Mason busied himself preparing a simple meal, his mind racing through possibilities. Had they tracked him here? If so, why the badge on his table belonged to a man who had ceased to exist 15 years ago. Sheriff Mason Calloway of Silver Creek had disappeared after the Apache incident, replaced by this solitary rancher who avoided towns and kept no company. Yet these women had found him, and there was something unsettlingly familiar about them. Something in Elena's eyes, that stirred memories Mason had worked hard to bury. They ate in relative silence, the women accepting the food with murmured thanks. Outside, the storm arrived in earnest rain, pounding against the roof and wind howling around the cabin's corners. Mason watched how they ate carefully with dignity, despite their obvious hunger. Nara's pain was evident in the tight lines around her mouth, but she made no complaint. "You can take the back room for the night," Mason finally said, gesturing toward the small bedroom. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." "You are generous," Elena said, helping her sister to stand. "Thank you." Mason nodded, already preparing for what would come next. For 15 years, he'd employed the same test whenever strangers sought shelter in his home, a simple deception that had kept him alive. He would pretend to sleep and listen to what they said when they thought he couldn't hear them. People revealed their true intentions when they believed themselves unobserved. As the women settled in the back room, Mason arranged his bedroll near the hearth, placing his revolver beneath the folded blanket that served as his pillow. He added another log to the fire, ensuring it would burn through most of the night, then extinguished the oil lamp. Stretched out on his bedroll, Mason slowed his breathing, falling into the familiar rhythm of feigned sleep. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, providing a constant backdrop of noise that might make the women less cautious in their conversation. He waited patient as a predator for them to reveal why they had really come. For nearly an hour, the only sounds were the storm and the occasional crackle of the fire. Then from the back room came the soft murmur of voices. At first, Mason could make out only the cadence, two women speaking in hushed tones. But as he strained to listen, something extraordinary happened. The women weren't speaking English. They were speaking Apache, and Mason understood every word. "He is the one from Nahele's prophecy," Elena was saying, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I am certain of it. Did you not see the badge and the bullet on his table?" "I saw," Nara replied, her voice tinged with doubt. "But he seems broken, sister. A shell of a man. How can he help us find justice if he has none for himself?" Mason's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced his breathing to remain even, his body still. The Apache language flowed back to him with shocking clarity, words and phrases his father had taught him, rising from some deep reservoir of memory he'd thought long dry. "Nahele said the former sheriff would redeem himself when the great storm came," Elena continued. He said the man who witnessed his death would finally speak the truth. Nahele said many things before he died. Nara countered a hint of bitterness in her tone. He also said our mother would return to us, and she lies in the ground these 15 years. There was a pause, filled only by the howl of the wind and the distant crack of thunder. This man carries the weight of his silence like stones in his pockets, Elena said finally. Did you not see how he looks at that bullet? It is the one that killed our brother. I am sure of it. Mason fought to keep his breathing steady, though panic clawed at his chest. Nahele. They were speaking of Nahele Whitefeather, the young Apache man whose death had changed everything. The death Mason had witnessed and done nothing to prevent. The death he'd been paid to keep silent about. Even if he is the one, Nara said, why would he help us now? After 15 years of hiding, after taking Harrington's blood money, because the burden of truth grows heavier with time, Elena replied. And I believe this man is drowning beneath its weight. Another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin briefly, followed by a tremendous crack of thunder that shook the walls. In that moment of brightness, Mason caught a glimpse of his father's journal tucked away on a shelf across the room. The leather-bound book contained the only record of his father's life. Among the Apache people, a life Mason had never fully understood until it was too late. We should rest, Elena said. Tomorrow, when the storm passes, we will speak with him directly. And if he denies everything, if he refuses to help us, then we follow Harrington's men to this place as planned. Elena's voice hardened. And we take what we need. The conversation faded into silence, leaving Mason alone with the storm and the terrible weight of revelation. They knew who he was. They knew about Wade Harrington. And they were here because of Nahele Whitefeather, the young Apache who had called out to Mason's conscience with his dying breath. Where is your conscience, Sheriff? The words echoed in Mason's mind, as clear now as they had been 15 years ago, spoken through blood-flecked lips as life drained from Nahele's eyes. Sleep was impossible. Mason lay awake through the long hours of the night, listening to the storm's gradual weakening and the soft, even breathing of the two women in his back room. Every detail of that fateful day 15 years ago played in his mind with cruel clarity. He had been sheriff of Silver Creek for nearly a decade when the trouble started. Wade Harrington, a wealthy merchant with ambitions of expanding his cattle empire, had begun pressuring local ranchers to sell their land. Those who refused often found themselves facing mysterious problems: cattle disappearing, water sources suddenly drying up, barn fires in the night. Nothing that could be directly tied to Harrington, of course, but everyone knew. The Apache Reservation lay to the north of Silver Creek, and Harrington had set his sights on a fertile valley that technically belonged to the tribe according to government treaties. But treaties were just paper, and paper burned easily in the frontier. Nahele Whitefeather, a respected young man among his people, despite his youth, had come to town to file a formal complaint against Harrington's men for rustling Apache cattle. Mason had taken the report promised to investigate, but they both knew it would go nowhere. White men's justice rarely extended to Indian grievances. What neither of them expected was Harrington's immediate and violent response. 3 days later, Mason had been called to the edge of town where a body had been found. Nahele Whitefeather shot through the chest at close range. Mason had found evidence pointing directly to Harrington, a unique silver bullet from a custom pistol. The merchant was known to carry boot prints matching his expensive Eastern footwear. But before Mason could complete his investigation, Harrington had approached him with an offer $1,000 in cash to rule the death as self-defense during an Apache raid attempt, and to resign his position immediately afterward. $1,000. More money than Mason had ever seen in one place. enough to buy land far from Silver Creek and start a new life. All for the simple act of staying silent about what he knew to be true. To his eternal shame, Mason had taken the money. He'd filed the report, as Harrington wanted, pinned the murder on a fictional Apache raiding party, and turned in his badge the following day. Within a week, he was gone from Silver Creek, the blood money burning a hole in his saddlebags, and Nahile's final words burning a hole in his soul. As dawn approached, painting the cabin walls in shades of gray, Mason heard the women beginning to stir. He rose from his bedroll, knowing that the pretense of sleep was pointless now. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a fresh, clean morning, and the inescapable truth he'd been running from for 15 years. "I know you're awake," came Elena's voice from the back room. "We heard your breathing change when the lightning struck close to the cabin." Mason's blood ran cold. They'd known he was listening. The entire conversation had been deliberate, designed to test him just as he had tried to test them. The hunters had become the hunted. He stood and faced the back room as Elena emerged, her dark eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. Behind her, Nara limped into view, her face set in a guarded expression. "You understand our language," Elena stated rather than asked. "You knew what we were saying." Mason saw no point in denial. "Yes? Then you know why we've come. You think I can help you find justice for your brother." Elena studied him, her gaze traveling to the scar on his cheek, then to the badge and bullet still lying on the table. "Not think. No. You were there when Nahele died. You saw who killed him. A lot of men die on the frontier," Mason said, his voice carefully neutral. "What makes you think I remember one Apache from 15 years ago? Because you kept the bullet that killed him." Nara spoke up, her voice sharp with accusation. "Because you abandoned your badge the day after his death. Because you ran." Mason felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the phantom weight of that silver star he'd worn for 10 years before discarding it in disgrace. "How did you find me?" he asked, buying time to collect his thoughts. "We followed Harrington's men," Elena explained. "They've been watching you for years, making sure you kept your silence. Did you not know?" The revelation struck Mason like a physical blow. Harrington had been monitoring him all this time. The isolation he'd thought was protection had been nothing but an illusion. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked, though he already knew the answer. "The truth," Elena said simply. "And then justice." The morning light spilled through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Outside, birds had begun their dawn chorus, oblivious to the tension building within the cabin's walls. "Sit," Mason said, gesturing to the table. "If we're going to have this conversation, we might as well do it properly." Elena helped Nara to a chair, then took one herself. Mason remained standing, moving to the shelf where his father's journal lay. He retrieved the worn leather book, holding it for a moment, before placing it on the table between them. "My father kept this," he said, his voice low. "Records of the time he spent living among your people." Elena's eyes widened slightly, her composure slipping for the first time. "Your father lived with the Apache 20 years ago." Mason nodded. "For nearly 3 years. He was a surveyor mapping the territory for the government. He met an Apache woman, fell in love with her." "And he taught you our language," Elena surmised, studying him with new interest. "Yes." Mason's hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his cheek. "He taught me many things about your people. Things I chose to forget when I pinned on this badge." He tapped the tarnished star on the table, unable to bring himself to touch it directly. "My father believed in justice for all people, white, Apache, Mexican." He taught me that a man's word was his bond, that the truth was sacred. Mason's voice grew bitter. But he died before I became sheriff, before I learned how easily principles can be sold when the price is right. Nahile was our half-brother, Nara said suddenly, her dark eyes fixed on Mason's face. Did you know that when you let his killer go free? The revelation hit Mason like a bucket of ice water. Half-brother, the woman your father loved was our mother. Elena explained, her voice steady, despite the emotion in her eyes. She was already married to our father, a respected elder, but she and your father formed a connection. When your father left, he did not know she was carrying his child. Nahile was my father's son, Mason whispered, the implications cascading through his mind like dominoes. Your half-brother, Elena confirmed. He had your father's eyes. Did you not see it when you found him dying? Mason sank heavily into the remaining chair, memories reshuffling themselves in his mind. The young Apache man's eyes, as life faded from them, those hadn't been accusation in those final moments, but recognition. Somehow Nahile had known who Mason was, had seen their shared blood. I didn't know, he managed, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. I swear to you, I didn't know. Would it have mattered? Nara challenged, leaning forward despite her injured leg. Would you have still taken Harrington's money if you had known Nahile was your own blood? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable and damning. Mason had no defense to offer, no justification that would hold against the terrible truth he had betrayed, not just his oath as a sheriff, but his own family. Tell us what happened that day, Elena said, her voice gentler now. All of it. Mason closed his eyes, gathering his courage. For 15 years he had spoken these events to no one, had barely allowed himself to remember them in the privacy of his own thoughts. It was a Tuesday. He began, the words coming slowly at first, then faster as the dam of silence finally broke. Nahile had come to town 3 days earlier to file a complaint about cattle rustling on Apache land. He'd seen Harrington's men driving a small herd away from the northern valley. I told him I'd look into it, but we both knew what that meant on the frontier. Indian complaints rarely got investigated. Mason's hands tightened into fists on the table as he continued. But Nahile was persistent. He had evidence, brands altered on the cattle, a witness from the reservation who'd seen Harrington's foreman leading the operation. He threatened to take it to the federal Indian agent if I wouldn't act. And Harrington couldn't allow that. Elena nodded, understanding. 3 days later, a ranch hand found a body at the edge of town. Nahile shot through the chest with a silver bullet. Mason's eyes flicked to the tarnished slug on the table. Harrington carried a custom Colt, with silver bullets, claimed they were more accurate, but really it was just vanity, a way to show off his wealth. You found evidence linking him to the murder, Nara stated rather than asked. Boot prints matching his expensive Eastern footwear. The silver bullet. A scrap of fabric from his jacket caught on a thorny bush near the body. Yes, I had evidence. Mason's voice hardened. Enough to hang him. But you didn't arrest him, Elena prompted when Mason fell silent. He came to my office that night, offered me $1,000 to rule Nahile's death as self-defense during an attempted Apache raid. Mason's voice dropped to a whisper. Said if I didn't take the deal, I'd be found with an Apache arrow in my chest the next morning. And you believed him, Nara's voice dripped with contempt. I believed him, Mason acknowledged, unable to meet her gaze. Harrington owned half the town already. The mayor, the judge, most of the merchants, all in his pocket. Even if I'd arrested him, he never would have seen the inside of a jail cell for killing an Apache. So you took his money, Elena concluded, filed a false report. Left your badge behind. Yes, the single word contained 15 years of self-loathing. What you may not know, Elena continued after a moment, is what happened after you left. Harrington used Nahele's death, this fictional Apache raid attempt, as justification for a retaliatory strike against our people. Mason's head snapped up. What are you saying? 3 days after you rode out of Silver Creek, a group of men attacked our village. Nara said, her voice taut with old pain. Said they were there to punish us. For the raid. 8 people died, including our mother. Horror washed over Mason in a cold wave. I never knew. I never thought. Of course you didn't, Nara said bitterly. You were too busy running with your blood money. Nara, Elena placed a restraining hand on her sister's arm. We did not come here for vengeance. Then why did you come? Mason asked, the weight of these new revelations crushing against his chest. Why now, after 15 years, Elena reached into a pouch at her waist and withdrew a folded document, placing it carefully on the table beside Mason's father's journal. Because of this, she said, found among our mother's possessions after her death. We did not understand what it meant until recently. Mason unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. It was a marriage certificate, faded but official, bearing the signatures of a territorial judge and 2 witnesses. The names made his breath catch. Jacob Calloway and Morning Star, legally wed according to territorial law. My father married your mother, Mason whispered, stunned. In secret, yes, Elena nodded. This certificate gives Nahele, as your father's legitimate son, legal claim to the land Harrington has stolen from our people. Land now worth a fortune with the coming of the railroad. Mason stared at the document, understanding dawning slowly. This is why Harrington killed Nahele. Not just because of the rustling complaint, but because he somehow learned Nahele had a legal claim to the land. Yes, Elena confirmed. And why he had our mother killed in the raid. She knew about the marriage. She could have proven Nahele's claim. But she never showed anyone this certificate, Mason said, puzzled. She was waiting, Elena explained, for your father to return as he had promised. She never stopped believing he would come back for her. A heavy silence filled the cabin as Mason absorbed this information. His father had never spoken of a legal marriage, had only mentioned his love for an Apache woman in vague, wistful terms. Had he truly intended to return? Had something prevented him, or had Jacob Calloway simply been another white man who made promises to an Indian woman he never intended to keep? There's something else you should know, Elena said, breaking into his thoughts. Harrington knows you're here. He's been having you watched for years. And he's coming, Mason Calloway, coming to silence you for good. Mason's hand instinctively moved toward his gun. How do you know this? We've been tracking his men for months, Nara explained. 2 of them were in a saloon 3 nights ago, drinking heavily. They spoke of coming here to your ranch. Said Harrington was worried you might talk now that the Railroad Commission is investigating land claims in the territory. When? Mason demanded. Today. Tomorrow at the latest, Elena replied. They were a day's ride behind us. Mason stood abruptly, moving to the window to scan the horizon. The storm had passed, leaving the prairie washed clean and bright in the morning sun. No dust clouds yet, indicating approaching riders. But that didn't mean much. If Harrington's men were any good, they'd approach with caution. What exactly do you want from me? He asked, turning back to the sisters. Come back to Silver Creek with us, Elena said simply. Tell the truth about what happened to Nahele. Help us reclaim what is rightfully ours, what should have been our brother's inheritance. Harrington will kill me the moment I set foot in Silver Creek, Mason objected. Not if we have this, Elena tapped the marriage certificate. Not if we have your testimony. The Railroad Commission has sent federal agents to investigate land claims. Men even Harrington can't bribe or threaten. Mason paced the small confines of the cabin, mind racing through options. He could run, pack up, and disappear deeper into the territory. But how long could he keep running? How many more years could he live with the weight of his betrayal? Before he died, Elena said softly, watching Mason's internal struggle. Nahele had a vision. He said the man who witnessed his death would one day return and speak the truth. That when the great storm came, this man would find his conscience again. Mason stopped pacing, his eyes drawn to the bullet on the table, the physical embodiment of his shame and cowardice. "I'm not the man your brother saw in his vision," he said finally. "That man would have done the right thing 15 years ago." "Perhaps," Elena acknowledged, "or perhaps Nahele saw further than you think. Perhaps he knew you would need these 15 years of carrying your burden before you could find the strength to lay it down." A sound outside caught Mason's attention, the distant whinny of a horse. He moved quickly to the window, scanning the horizon. There, just visible through the morning haze, a plume of dust rose from the prairie. Riders were approaching. "They're coming," he said, turning back to the sisters. "At least 3, maybe 4 riders." Nara struggled to her feet, grimacing as she put weight on her injured leg. "Then we must decide now, Sheriff Calloway. Will you run again, or will you finally stand and face the truth?" Mason looked from one sister to the other, these women who had tracked him across the territory not for vengeance, but for justice. For their brother, his brother, for a truth that had been buried too long. His eyes fell on his father's journal, on the marriage certificate that proved Jacob Calloway had been a better man than his son had ever given him credit for. Finally, Mason's gaze settled on the tarnished sheriff's badge that had once meant everything to him. "I'm done running," he said, reaching for the badge. He didn't pin it on, he hadn't earned that right yet, but he slipped it into his pocket along with the silver bullet. "But we need to prepare. Harrington didn't send these men to talk." As Mason moved to check his rifle and gather ammunition, he felt something shift inside him, a weight beginning to lift, a purpose taking hold where only emptiness had resided for 15 years. He didn't know if he would survive the coming confrontation, but for the first time since he'd watched Nahele Whitefeather die, Mason Calloway was no longer afraid to face himself in the mirror. Outside, the riders drew steadily closer, dust rising behind them like the storm clouds of the previous night. But within Mason's cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that had been 15 years in the making, one that would finally bring the truth to light, whatever the cost. Mason moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had prepared for danger his entire life. He checked his Winchester rifle, counting out shells and placing them within easy reach. The familiar routine steadied his hands even as his mind raced through possible scenarios. 4 riders against 3 defenders, and one of those defenders injured. The odds weren't good. "Elena," he called over his shoulder, "there's a loose floorboard beneath the bed in the back room. Lift it up. You'll find a box with extra ammunition and a Colt revolver." She nodded sharply and disappeared into the bedroom. Nara watched her sister go, then turned to Mason with narrowed eyes. "You've been expecting trouble for a long time," she observed. 15 years, Mason confirmed, not looking up from his preparations. "Though I always thought it would be Apache warriors seeking vengeance, not Harrington's hired guns." A bitter smile touched Nara's lips. "Our people have long memories, Sheriff, but we also know where to direct our anger. You were a coward, not a killer." The blunt assessment stung, but Mason couldn't argue with its truth. He had been a coward. Perhaps he still was. But courage, his father had once told him, wasn't the absence of fear, it was action in the face of it. Elena returned with the revolver and a box of ammunition. "The riders will be here within minutes," she said, moving to the window to peer out. "4 men, as you suspected." "Can you shoot?" Mason asked, looking at Nara and her injured leg. Nara's expression hardened with determination. "Well enough to make them cautious." Mason nodded, formulating a plan. "Elena, take position by the back window. If things go badly, you two slip out that way and make for the tree line beyond the corral. The horses are saddled and ready." "And you?" Elena asked, her dark eyes studying him intently. "I'll buy you time," Mason replied simply. "No." Elena's voice was firm. "We did not come all this way to watch you throw your life away. We face this together." Before Mason could argue, the sound of approaching hooves grew distinct. He moved to the front window, keeping to one side as he assessed the riders. In the lead rode a gray-haired man with the straight-backed posture of someone accustomed to command. Wade Harrington had aged in the 15 years since Mason had last seen him, but there was no mistaking the cold calculation in those pale blue eyes, the set of his jaw that spoke of absolute confidence in his own authority. He wore fine clothes despite the long ride, a tailored suit beneath a long duster-polished boots that had clearly never worked a day of honest labor. Behind him rode 3 men whose very posture declared their profession gunmen hardened by years of violence, the kind who asked no questions when the money was good. Mason recognized the type well. He'd dealt with plenty during his years wearing a badge. "Looks like Harrington decided to come himself," Mason murmured, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "That's unexpected." Elena joined him at the window, keeping carefully out of sight. "He must consider you a significant threat to come personally." "Or he wants the pleasure of seeing me die," Mason replied grimly. "We had history even before Nahele's murder." The riders drew up in the yard, maintaining a cautious distance from the cabin. Harrington remained mounted, sitting tall in his saddle as he surveyed Mason's modest homestead with obvious disdain. "Mason Calloway," Harrington's voice carried easily across the yard, confident and commanding. "I know you're in there. Come on out, so we can talk like civilized men." Mason exchanged a look with Elena. "Stay out of sight," he whispered. "He doesn't know you're here. That's our only advantage." She nodded, moving back from the window and gesturing for Nara to keep low. Mason took a deep breath, steadying himself for the confrontation 15 years in the making. He tucked his revolver into his waistband at the small of his back, out of sight, but accessible, and stepped onto the porch. "Harrington," he acknowledged, keeping his voice neutral as he surveyed the 4 men and their weapons. "Long ride from Silver Creek. What brings you to my doorstep after all these years?" Harrington's thin lips curved into what might generously be called a smile. "Can't an old friend pay a visit?" "It's been too long, Sheriff." "Not your sheriff anymore," Mason corrected evenly. "Haven't been for 15 years. "No," Harrington agreed, his pale eyes never leaving Mason's face. "But you're still keeping our bargain. Or you were, until recently." He paused, studying Mason with the cold assessment of a butcher eyeing livestock. "I'm concerned about you, Mason. Heard some troubling rumors." Mason leaned against the porch post, affecting a casual posture that belied the tension coiled within him. "What kind of rumors would those be? That you've been entertaining thoughts of returning to Silver Creek? That you've been talking to people about old business best left buried?" Harrington's voice hardened slightly. "Indian business." "Haven't left this ranch in months," Mason replied truthfully. "Haven't spoken to anyone about anything." "Good," Harrington nodded, seemingly satisfied. "That's good to hear, Mason, because I've built something significant in Silver Creek. Something that benefits everyone, new businesses, the railroad coming through, prosperity. I'm sure the prosperity benefits some more than others," Mason observed, his tone deliberately mild. Harrington ignored the implication. The Federal Railroad Commission is sniffing around land claims in the territory, looking into ownership records treaties with the Indians, that sort of bureaucratic nonsense. He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. It would be unfortunate if someone were to muddy those waters with inaccurate recollections of past events. And there it was, the threat beneath the veneer of civility. Mason felt a familiar chill. For 15 years, this man had held power over him through a combination of bribery and intimidation. For 15 years, Mason had allowed it. "Why don't you come inside?" Mason offered, making a swift decision. "We can discuss these recollections in private." Harrington studied him for a long moment, suspicion evident in his narrowed eyes. "Just you and me. My men will wait out here." "Just you and me," Mason agreed, stepping aside to let Harrington enter the cabin first. As Harrington dismounted and approached the porch, Mason caught the eye of one of the gunmen, a hard-faced man with a scar bisecting his right eyebrow. The man's hand rested casually near his holstered weapon, his posture alert despite his seemingly relaxed pose. These weren't typical hired muscle. They were experienced killers. If things went badly, getting Elena and Nara away safely would be nearly impossible. Harrington climbed the steps, and Mason noted how the merchant's hand rested on the ornate grip of a custom Colt revolver, the twin of the weapon that had fired the silver bullet now residing in Mason's pocket. The bullet that had killed Nahele. "Quite the isolated spot you've chosen," Harrington remarked as he entered the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the sparse furnishings. "Though I suppose isolation suits a man with secrets." "We all have secrets," Mason replied, closing the door behind them. "Some more damning than others." If Harrington was unsettled by finding himself alone with Mason, he showed no sign of it. He moved to the table, his gloved fingers brushing over Mason's father's journal with casual disregard. "I've been keeping tabs on you, Mason," he said, his tone conversational. "All these years, making sure our arrangement held firm." He turned, fixing Mason with a pointed stare. 15 years is a long time to maintain a secret. Conscience has a way of becoming burdensome." "You'd know nothing about that," Mason responded, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Harrington chuckled, a sound devoid of genuine humor. "There you're wrong. I know a great deal about burdens, about difficult choices made for the greater good." He began to pace slowly, his boots striking the wooden floor with measured steps. "Silver Creek was nothing when I arrived. A dusty frontier outpost, barely clinging to existence. Look at it now, a thriving community with a future. Built on stolen land and murdered Indians," Mason said quietly. Harrington stopped pacing, his expression sharpening. "So you have been reconsidering our arrangement?" It wasn't a question. "That's disappointing, Mason. Very disappointing." "I've had 15 years to think about what happened," Mason replied, watching Harrington carefully. "About Nahele Whitefeather, about the Apache raid that never happened." "Ancient history," Harrington dismissed with a wave of his gloved hand. "What matters is the future. Silver Creek's future. My future." His eyes narrowed. "Your future such as it is." Mason could feel the weight of the badge in his pocket, the silver bullet beside it, physical reminders of his shame of the justice he had failed to deliver. "I saw the Railroad Commission representatives in town last week," Harrington continued. "Eastern men with ledgers and land surveys talking about clear title and prior claims. They're particularly interested in the Northern Valley." His voice hardened. "The valley that's been the center of my cattle operation for 15 years. The valley that belonged to the Apache," Mason noted. "According to the treaties." "Treaties?" Harrington scoffed. "Pieces of paper signed by bureaucrats who've never set foot west of the Mississippi." The frontier isn't built on paper, Mason. It's built by men with vision and the courage to seize opportunity. Is that what you call murdering Nahile Whitefeather, seizing opportunity? Harrington's face tightened almost imperceptibly, the only indication that Mason's direct accusation had struck home. The Indian was creating problems, he said dismissively, stirring up trouble among the reservation Apache, threatening to go to the federal Indian agent. He had evidence you were rustling Apache cattle, Mason pressed, watching for reactions. He was within his rights. Rights? Harrington's laugh was short and sharp. An Indian challenging a white businessman over a few head of cattle. The very notion is absurd. He moved closer to Mason, lowering his voice. You understood that 15 years ago, Sheriff. You understood the natural order of things. What I understood, Mason replied, was that you threatened to kill me if I didn't take your blood money and look the other way. And yet, you took it. Harrington pointed out, his smile cold. Quite eagerly, as I recall. That money built this ranch, didn't it? Gave you this? He glanced around the cabin with evident disdain. Life you've made for yourself. Mason felt shame burn in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. Why are you here, Harrington? After 15 years of having your men watch me from a distance, why come yourself now? Harrington studied him, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. The railroad changes everything. When it comes through land, values will multiply tenfold. The Commission is reviewing all land claims in the territory, especially those involving Indian treaties. He paused. There are rumors that someone has evidence that might call my ownership of the Northern Valley into question. Mason thought of the marriage certificate Elena had shown him of Nahile's legitimate claim as Jacob Calloway's son. Harrington was right to be worried. What does that have to do with me? Mason asked, deliberately playing ignorant. You're the former sheriff who investigated the Apache raid 15 years ago, Harrington replied. Your testimony about what happened that night, about the Apache uprising that necessitated defensive measures, would carry weight with the Commission. And there it was, the real reason for Harrington's visit. Not just to ensure Mason's continued silence, but to actively use him to legitimize the lies they had constructed 15 years ago. You want me to perjure myself to the Railroad Commission, Mason stated flatly, to swear that Nahile Whitefeather was killed during an Apache raid that never happened. I want you to confirm the official record, Harrington corrected smoothly. The record you yourself created as sheriff. His hand moved to rest on his holstered pistol, not drawing it, but reminding Mason of its presence. In exchange, I'm prepared to be generous. Very generous. How generous? Mason asked, playing for time as he assessed the situation. Through the window, he could see Harrington's men still mounted, their attention focused on the cabin. In the corner of his vision, he caught a glimpse of movement, Elena positioned near the back window, the Colt revolver ready in her hand. $5,000, Harrington said, watching Mason's face for his reaction. Plus a clear title to this ranch and the surrounding 500 acres, all perfectly legal and recognized by the territorial government. $5,000 of fortune on the frontier, more than Mason could hope to earn in 10 years of honest work. The temptation of it, the security it represented, brushed against him like a physical touch. For a moment, he could see the path of least resistance stretching before him. Take the money, tell the lies, continue the quiet existence he'd built. But then he thought of Nahile's eyes as the life drained from them, of Elena and Nara, who had lost not just their brother, but their mother to Harrington's greed, of his own father, who had loved an Apache woman enough to marry her against all the conventions of frontier society. And if I refuse, he asked quietly. Harrington's expression hardened, the veneer of civility falling away like a discarded mask. Then you won't live to see the Railroad Commission. Accidents happen on the frontier, Mason. Men disappear. Bodies are rarely found. You've gotten away with murder before, Mason acknowledged. What's one more precisely? Harrington nodded, apparently pleased that Mason understood the situation. So we have a deal. You'll testify to the commission about the Apache raid, confirm the official story, and walk away a wealthy man. Mason was silent for a long moment, weighing 15 years of cowardice against the possibility of redemption. Outside, the sun had risen fully, bathing the prairie in golden light. A new day. Perhaps, at last, a chance for a new beginning. You know, Mason said finally, my father used to say that a man's word is sacred, that once given it defines who he is more surely than anything else in this world. He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the tarnished badge and the silver bullet. For 15 years, I've been defined by a lie. By the moment I took your money and turned my back on justice. Wariness crept into Harrington's expression. This is no time for philosophy, Mason. I need your answer. Yes or no? Mason withdrew his hand from his pocket. The silver bullet caught between his fingers, gleaming dully in the morning light. Do you recognize this? Harrington's eyes fixed on the bullet, his expression unreadable. Should I? It's the bullet that killed Nahile Whitefeather, Mason said quietly. From your gun. The bullet I should have presented as evidence 15 years ago. A bullet proves nothing, Harrington scoffed, though a hint of unease had entered his voice. And even if it did, it's your word against mine. The word of a disgraced former sheriff against one of the most respected businessmen in the territory. Perhaps, Mason agreed, though the Railroad Commission might find it interesting that you came all this way to offer me a bribe. Harrington's face hardened. Be very careful about your next decision, Mason. Very careful indeed. I've made my decision, Mason replied, closing his hand around the bullet. I'm done running from the truth. Done living with the weight of what I allowed to happen. A cold smile spread across Harrington's face. Noble sentiments, but you seem to have miscalculated your position. He moved toward the window, glancing out at his men. You're one man, Mason. One aging, disgraced lawman against me and my resources. How do you imagine this ends for you? Before Mason could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. He is not alone. Harrington whirled toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. Elena stood in the doorway of the back room, the Colt revolver held steady in her hand. Behind her, Nara emerged, a rifle braced against her shoulder, despite her injured leg. What is this? Harrington demanded, his gaze darting between the sisters and Mason. Who are these women? You don't recognize them, Mason asked quietly. Look closer, Harrington. Look at their eyes. Harrington studied the women, confusion gradually giving way to dawning recognition. Apache, he breathed, his hand tightening on his gun grip. You've allied yourself with Indians. Not just any Apache, Elena said, her voice steady, despite the tension vibrating in the air. Look again, Wade Harrington. Look at the faces of those you thought you had silenced forever. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Harrington's features, followed by a flash of genuine fear as comprehension struck him. The Whitefeather sisters, he said, his voice dropping to near a whisper. You're supposed to be dead. The raid, 8 died that day. Nara confirmed, her dark eyes burning with the memory. Our mother among them. But some of us survived to seek justice. Harrington's composure fractured, the confident businessman replaced by a man confronting ghosts he thought long buried. Justice, he spat, desperation edging into his voice. "There's no justice on the frontier except what men like me create. Everything I've built, everything Silver Creek has become, it's because of my vision, my determination." "Your lies," Mason corrected quietly. "Your murders." Harrington's gaze darted between the three of them, calculating his odds. "My men are right outside," he warned. "One shot and they'll be in here, guns blazing." "Perhaps," Elena acknowledged, "but you'll be dead before they cross the threshold." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Mason could hear the soft sound of the wind through the open window, the distant call of a hawk hunting across the prairie. The tableau held balanced on a knife's edge of possibility. Then, with deliberate slowness, Harrington raised his hands in a gesture of concession. "It seems I've underestimated the situation," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier composure. "Perhaps we can discuss this like rational people. Find a solution that benefits everyone." "The only solution," Mason replied, "is the truth. The whole truth before the Railroad Commission and the Territorial Court." "You're asking me to confess to murder," Harrington said incredulously. "To throw away everything I've built over a 15-year-old shooting of an Apache troublemaker." "Our brother," Nara corrected sharply. "Nahele Whitefeather. Say his name." Harrington's jaw tightened, but he complied. "Nahele Whitefeather, then. One man against the prosperity I've brought to hundreds. Is that justice?" "It's a start," Mason said. He withdrew the marriage certificate from his pocket, holding it up for Harrington to see. "Do you know what this is?" Harrington squinted at the document, confusion evident on his face. "A marriage certificate. What does that have to do with anything?" "It proves that Nahele Whitefeather was the legitimate son of Jacob Calloway," Mason explained. "My father, and the rightful heir to a significant portion of the Northern Valley land you've claimed as your own." The color drained from Harrington's face as the implications registered. "That's impossible. That land was unclaimed when you began fencing it 15 years ago," Mason interrupted. "No, Harrington, it wasn't unclaimed. It belonged to the Apache by treaty, and to Nahele by right of inheritance through my father." "A convenient document to suddenly discover," Harrington sneered, though his bravado seemed forced. "Likely a forgery." "The territorial judge who performed the ceremony is still alive in Santa Fe," Elena said calmly, "as is one of the witnesses. The Railroad Commission will find their testimony quite compelling, I imagine." Harrington's eyes darted to the door, clearly calculating his chances of reaching his men outside. Mason recognized the desperation building in the merchant's expression, the dangerous realization that he had nothing left to lose. "Even if what you say is true," Harrington said slowly, "what exactly do you propose? That I confess to killing your brother, surrender my land, allow myself to be hanged?" He shook his head. "I think not. What we propose," Mason replied, "is that you face the consequences of your actions, that you answer for Nahele's murder, for the raid that killed Elena and Nara's mother, for 15 years of profiting from stolen land and spilled blood. And if I refuse, then we take this evidence to the Railroad Commission," Elena said simply, "to the Territorial Court, to the newspapers in Santa Fe, and as far east as St. Louis. Your name will be synonymous with murder and theft. Everything you've built will crumble." Harrington was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as he appeared to consider his options. When he finally spoke, his voice had acquired a strange calm. "You know, Mason, I always thought you were smarter than this. More practical." He sighed as if genuinely disappointed. "But it seems the years in isolation have clouded your judgment." In one fluid motion, faster than Mason would have believed possible for a man of his age, Harrington drew his ornate Colt and fired. The bullet struck the wall inches from Elena's head, sending splinters of wood flying as she ducked for cover. Nara returned fire immediately, her rifle shot going wide as Harrington dove behind the table, upending it to create a barrier. Outside, the gunmen reacted to the sounds of shooting, dismounting, and drawing their weapons as they ran toward the cabin. Mason lunged for his Winchester, bringing it up just as Harrington aimed for a second shot at Elena. "Drop it, Harrington!" Mason shouted. "It's over! Nothing's over while I'm breathing!" Harrington snarled, swinging his pistol toward Mason instead. Two shots rang out simultaneously, Harrington's bullet grazing Mason's arm, while Mason's shot struck Harrington in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his custom Colt clattering to the floor. Harrington stumbled, clutching his wounded shoulder, his face contorted with pain and rage. "Kill them!" he bellowed toward the door where his men were now visible weapons drawn. "Kill them all!" The gunfight erupted in earnest, then bullets splintering through the cabin walls as Harrington's men opened fire from outside. Mason dove for cover beside Elena, both of them returning fire through the windows. Nara, despite her injured leg, had positioned herself near the back door, picking her shots with careful precision. "We need to get to the horses," Mason shouted over the gunfire. "We're too exposed here." Elena nodded, firing again before ducking down as bullets tore through the window frame above her head. "What about him?" she asked, gesturing toward Harrington, who had crawled behind a heavy oak chest, still clutching his bleeding shoulder. "He comes with us," Mason decided. "He's our evidence." A momentary lull in the shooting gave them an opening. "Nara!" Elena called. "Cover us!" Nara nodded, rising to fire rapidly through the back window, forcing the gunman, who had circled around, to duck for cover. Mason seized the opportunity to lunge toward Harrington, grabbing the merchant by his uninjured arm and hauling him to his feet. "You're coming with us," he growled, pressing his revolver into Harrington's ribs. "Try anything, and I'll finish what I started." "My men will hunt you to the ends of the earth," Harrington hissed, his face pale from pain and blood loss. "Let them try," Mason replied grimly. With Elena leading the way and Nara providing covering fire, they made their way through the back door toward the small corral where Mason's horses were kept. The gunmen, realizing their quarry was escaping, redoubled their efforts, bullets kicking up dust at their feet as they ran. Elena reached the horses first quickly, untying the reins of the three already saddled mounts. Mason shoved Harrington toward one of the animals. "Get on," he ordered. "You'll ride with me." "I'm bleeding," Harrington protested, his voice weak. "I need a doctor." "You'll get one when we reach Silver Creek," Mason replied unsympathetically. "Now mount up or bleed out here. Your choice." As Nara limped toward them, a bullet struck the ground near her feet, causing her to stumble. Elena moved quickly to help her sister onto one of the horses, then swung into the saddle of her own mount. "Go!" Mason shouted, firing back toward the cabin to keep Harrington's men pinned down. "Head east toward the creek bed. I'll be right behind you." Elena hesitated only briefly, then urged her horse forward, leading Nara's mount by the reins as they galloped away from the corral. Mason turned to Harrington, who was struggling to mount with his injured shoulder. "Need a hand?" Mason asked dryly, keeping one eye on the gunmen who were now emerging cautiously from the cabin. "Go to hell, Calloway!" Harrington gasped, but accepted Mason's boost into the saddle. Mason swung up behind him, keeping his revolver pressed against Harrington's back as he kicked the horse into motion. Bullets whined past them as they galloped away from the cabin, following Elena and Nara's trail toward the east. Only when they had put a good mile between themselves and the cabin did Mason risk a glance back. Two of Harrington's men had mounted, and were giving chase, though they had fallen well behind. The third gunman was nowhere to be seen, likely wounded in the exchange of fire. "They'll follow us," Harrington said, his voice strained, but still carrying its characteristic arrogance. "You know that, don't you? This changes nothing." "It changes everything," Mason disagreed, urging the horse to greater speed. "The truth has a way of doing that." Twilight settled over the prairie like a violet shroud, bringing with it the first hint of evening's chill. The small party had pushed their horses hard throughout the afternoon, following the meandering creek bed eastward. Behind them, the dust cloud of their pursuers remained visible, but had not grown appreciably closer. Harrington's men were tracking them steadily, but seemed in no hurry to engage. "They're waiting for nightfall," Mason observed, scanning the darkening horizon with narrowed eyes. "They know these lands as well as I do. They'll close the distance in the dark." Elena nodded in agreement. "We cannot continue riding through the night. The horses are exhausted, and Harrington's wound needs tending." As if on cue, Harrington slumped slightly in the saddle ahead of Mason. The merchant had maintained a stoic silence for the past several hours, but Mason could feel the heat radiating from his body, the first sign of fever setting in, despite Elena's herbal treatment. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles ahead," Mason decided. "We can shelter there for the night's set watches. It's defensible at least." Nara, who had been riding ahead as scout, circled back to join them. "The creek turns north soon," she reported. "If we leave it and ride due east, we might lose them in the darkness." Mason considered the suggestion, weighing their options. Leaving the creek meant abandoning their water source and the sparse cover its trees provided, but continuing to follow its course would make them predictable targets. "We'll leave the creek," he decided. "Make for the line shack from the south approach. Might buy us a few hours if they keep following the water." They altered course as the last crimson streaks of sunset faded from the western sky. The prairie stretched around them, an ocean of grass turned silver in the rising moonlight. Without the sound of flowing water to mask their passage, the rhythmic hoofbeats of their mounts seemed unnaturally loud in the evening stillness. Harrington stirred, raising his head with visible effort. "You're making a mistake," he murmured, his voice hoarse with pain and thirst. "My men won't stop." "Neither will we," Mason replied grimly. "Save your strength, Harrington. You'll need it to face what's coming." The merchant gave a weak laugh that dissolved into a cough. "What's coming?" "A territorial court that I practically own, a railroad commission filled with men who understand the value of progress over sentimentality." He shook his head slightly. "You still don't understand the world we live in, Mason." "Never did." Mason said nothing, but Elena urged her horse closer, her expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "The world is changing, Wade Harrington," she said quietly. "The railroads bring more than just goods and settlers. They bring law. Real law, not frontier justice that can be bought with silver bullets and threats." "The strong survive," Harrington muttered. "Always have, always will." "Then perhaps you are not as strong as you believed," Nara observed coldly from her position ahead of them. "For here you are wounded and captured at the mercy of those you thought you had defeated." Harrington fell silent again, though Mason could feel the tension in his body. The merchant might be injured and feverish, but he was far from broken. Dangerous men rarely were even at their lowest point. The line shack appeared on the horizon just as the moon reached its zenith, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. Mason had used it occasionally over the years when working the far boundaries of his ranch, a simple one-room structure built decades earlier by cattle companies for their range riders. As they drew closer, Mason scanned the surroundings with practiced caution. The shack stood on a slight rise, offering decent visibility in all directions, a tactical advantage if Harrington's men found them during the night. A small corral adjoined the structure, though its poles had fallen into disrepair in places. "Looks clear," Mason announced as they reined in their mounts. "Nara, help me get Harrington inside. Elena, if you could see to the horses." Elena nodded, dismounting gracefully despite the long hours in the saddle. Mason slid down from his horse and reached up to help Harrington, noting with concern how the merchant swayed when his feet touched the ground. "Steady," Mason muttered, supporting Harrington's weight as Nara limped forward to take his other side. Together, they half-carried the injured man toward the shack's entrance. The interior was exactly as Mason remembered, spartanly furnished with a single cot, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a small iron stove in the corner. A layer of dust covered everything, evidence that no one had used the shelter in months. "Get him on the cot," Mason instructed as they maneuvered Harrington through the doorway. "I'll see if there's any firewood stacked out back." Nara nodded, guiding Harrington to the simple bed, while Mason stepped back outside. The night air was cool against his face, carrying the sweet scent of prairie grass and sage. For a moment, he stood motionless, allowing his eyes to readjust to the darkness as he scanned the horizon once more. No dust clouds, no movement, no distant glint of metal in the moonlight. Their pursuers had either lost their trail or more likely were approaching with greater caution now that night had fallen. Behind the shack, Mason found a small stack of firewood beneath a lean-to, not much, but enough to see them through the night. He gathered an armful and returned inside to find Elena had joined Nara. The 2 sisters were examining Harrington's wound by the light of a small oil lamp they must have found on the shelf above the stove. "Fever's rising," Elena reported without looking up. "The wound is hot to the touch. If we don't get him to a proper doctor soon, he may not survive to face justice." Mason deposited the firewood beside the stove and began preparing a fire. "Nearest doctor is in Silver Creek, still a good day's ride from here." He glanced at Harrington, who lay with eyes closed, his breathing shallow but regular. "Will your herbs help?" Elena shook her head slightly. "I've done what I can with what I have. The rest depends on his strength and the will of the spirits." "He has strength enough," Mason observed grimly. "Men like Harrington are sustained by their own ambition." As the small fire caught and began to spread warmth throughout the shack, Mason moved to the window, peering out into the moonlit prairie. "I'll take first watch," he offered. "You 2 should rest while you can. Tomorrow will be another hard day's ride." Neither sister argued, both clearly exhausted from the day's events. Nara stretched out on her blanket near the stove, her injured leg carefully positioned, while Elena settled nearby, her back against the wall, the revolver within easy reach. Mason took a chair and positioned it near the window, his Winchester resting across his knees. As the sisters drifted into sleep, and Harrington's ragged breathing became the only sound in the small space, Mason found his thoughts turning to his father's journal. All those stories Jacob Calloway had shared about his time among the Apache, the hunting trips, the ceremonies, the wisdom of the elders. Never once had he mentioned a wife, a son. Why keep such things secret from his own flesh and blood? The question gnawed at Mason as he kept his vigil, watching the silver-bathed prairie for signs of approaching danger. Around midnight, a soft sound drew Mason's attention back inside the shack. Harrington had awakened and was struggling to sit up, his face glistening with sweat despite the cool night. "Water!" The merchant rasped, his eyes fever-bright in the dim light from the banked fire. Mason hesitated, then rose from his chair and poured water from their canteen into a tin cup. He crossed to the cot and held the cup to Harrington's lips, supporting the man's head as he drank greedily. "Easy," Mason cautioned. "Small sips, or you'll just bring it back up." Harrington complied, though his eyes never left Mason's face. When he had finished drinking, Mason lowered him back against the thin mattress. "Why not just kill me, Mason?" Harrington asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It would be simpler. One bullet, and 15 years of secrets die with me." "Because I'm not you," Mason replied quietly, mindful of the sleeping sisters. "I don't solve problems with murder." A weak smile touched Harrington's lips. "No, you just take money to look the other way when others do the killing." The barb struck home, but Mason kept his expression neutral. "Still hiding behind principles when it suits you. Still the same sanctimonious lawman who thinks rules matter on the frontier." "The rules are all that separate us from animals," Mason countered. "All that keep the strong from simply devouring the weak." Harrington's smile widened slightly. "And yet, here we are. You, the righteous sheriff who sold his badge for $1,000. Me, the ruthless killer who built a town that will outlive us both." He shifted slightly, wincing as the movement jarred his wounded shoulder. "We're not so different, you and I. We both saw opportunity and took it. The only difference is, I never pretended to be something I'm not." Mason returned to his chair by the window, unwilling to continue a conversation that served only to reopen old wounds. But Harrington wasn't finished. "Your father was the same way," the merchant continued, his voice gaining strength, as if drawing energy from Mason's discomfort. "Full of high ideals about the dignity of the Apache, the sanctity of treaties. But in the end, he chose to leave them, to return to white civilization, to raise you among your own kind." "Until you put a bullet in his back," Mason said flatly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with accusation. Harrington's eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise flickering across his fever-flushed face. "So you know about that too," he said finally, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I wondered if you'd ever discovered the truth." Mason's hand tightened on his rifle. "I had my suspicions. My father was found dead from what everyone called a hunting accident, a single shot to the back. But he was too experienced a woodsman to be mistaken for game." "A necessary business decision," Harrington replied, unrepentant. He was going to undo years of careful work, going to challenge rightful ownership of valuable land, based on some misguided notion of Indian rights. He paused, studying Mason's profile in the dim light. "Do you know what Silver Creek was before I arrived? A dying whistle stop with one saloon and a general store always on the edge of bankruptcy. Look at it now. Hotels, banks, a proper courthouse. Civilization, Mason. Progress. Built on stolen land and murdered men. Built on vision and determination," Harrington corrected. "The Apache were never going to develop that valley, never going to bring the railroad through, never going to build something that would last beyond their primitive existence." Mason turned to face him, fully anger finally breaking through his careful control. "Those primitives managed to live in harmony with this land for centuries before men like you arrived with your vision and determination. They understood something you never will, Harrington, that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns but by what he protects." Harrington's expression hardened. Pretty sentiments from a man who abandoned his duty and ran at the first sign of trouble. Did you protect Nahele Whitefeather Sheriff? Did you protect his mother when my men rode into their village? Did you protect anything except your own skin? The words cut deep precisely as Harrington had intended. Mason fell silent, the familiar weight of shame settling over him like a physical burden. Everything the merchant said was true, no matter how maliciously delivered. Mason had failed in his duty, had chosen self-preservation over justice, had allowed evil to flourish through his inaction. No, Mason admitted finally. I didn't, and that's a burden I'll carry to my grave. He met Harrington's feverish gaze steadily. But it's not too late for justice, Harrington. Not for Nahile, not for my father, not for the Apache whose lives you destroyed. Justice? Harrington scoffed weakly. Another pretty word that means nothing on the frontier. Ask yourself this, Mason, if your precious justice prevails, what then? The Railroad Commission invalidates my claim to the Northern Valley. The Apache regain their land. Silver Creek withers and dies without the cattle trade. Is that justice, destroying the livelihoods of hundreds for the sake of the dead? Before Mason could respond, Elena's voice came from the darkness near the stove. The dead deserve remembrance, she said quietly, rising to her feet with fluid grace. She had clearly been awake for some time, listening to their exchange. And the living deserve truth. Without both, there can be no healing, no way forward. Harrington's gaze shifted to her, his expression calculating despite his obvious pain. And you believe your brother's death justifies destroying everything I've built, everything Silver Creek has become. I believe your crimes demand accountability, Elena replied evenly. The spirits of the dead cannot rest, while injustice remains unanswered. A strange expression crossed Harrington's face, part contempt, part genuine bewilderment. Spirits, he murmured. God's justice, all words created by the weak to constrain the strong to place limits on those with the vision to shape the world. No, Mason interjected, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. They're words that remind us of our humanity, Harrington. Something you abandoned long ago in pursuit of wealth and power. Harrington started to respond, but was interrupted by Nara, who had silently risen and moved to the window. Riders, she said tersely, 3 of them approaching from the west. Mason was instantly alert, joining her at the window. In the moonlight, he could make out 3 mounted figures moving cautiously across the prairie still some distance away, but clearly headed toward the line shack. They found us faster than I expected, he muttered, reaching for his rifle. Wake up or stay asleep, Harrington. Either way, keep quiet if you want to live through the night. Harrington's only response was a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mason turned into the sisters. Elena, cover the back window. Nara, watch Harrington. Don't let him try to signal his men. He checked the Winchester's action, ensuring a round was chambered. With luck, they'll approach cautiously. Give us time to prepare a proper welcome. Elena moved to the rear of the shack, positioning herself where she could observe the approach from the opposite direction. Nara took up station near Harrington, her dark eyes watchful as the merchant struggled to sit up against the wall. They'll kill all of you, Harrington said matter-of-factly. These aren't cowboys or drunken ranch hands. They're professional gunmen, and their leader Rollins is the most dangerous of all. Mason's eyes narrowed at the mention of the name. Rollins, my chief lieutenant, Harrington explained, a hint of pride entering his voice despite his condition. The one with the scar across his brow. 15 years in my employ, and not a man alive who's crossed him, and lived to tell about it. Mason returned to the window, studying the approaching riders with renewed concern. The foremost rider was, indeed, the scarred man he'd noticed earlier. If Harrington was to be believed, and Mason had no reason to doubt him on this point, they were facing a formidable adversary. What are our options? Elena asked quietly, joining Mason at the window. Fight or negotiate, Mason replied grimly. And I don't think Rawlins is the negotiating type. Nara's voice came from across the room, flat and determined. Then we fight. Mason shook his head slightly. 3 against 3 would be poor odds under the best circumstances. With Harrington wounded and you limping, it's worse than that. What do you suggest? Elena asked, her dark eyes studying his face. Mason was silent for a long moment, weighing impossible choices. Then, with sudden decision, he turned to Harrington. Your men will listen to you. Tell them to back off, and we all might live through the night. A weak laugh escaped Harrington's pale lips. And why would I do that? The moment they ride away, you'll kill me anyway. No, Mason said firmly. You have my word. You'll reach Silver Creek alive to face the Commission and the Territorial Court. Justice Harrington, not vengeance. The merchant's fever-bright eyes studied Mason with cynical amusement. Your word, the word of a man who betrayed his badge for money. That's what you're offering me? The barb struck home, but Mason kept his expression neutral. It's the only chance any of us have of seeing morning. Before Harrington could respond, the riders halted about 50 yards from the shack. One of them, Rawlins Mason assumed, called out in a voice that carried clearly through the night air. Harrington, we know you're in there. Send out the women and Calloway, and we'll let you live. A humorless smile twisted Harrington's mouth. It seems my loyal lieutenant has other plans for me. What's he talking about? Nara demanded, her rifle still trained on Harrington. Rawlins has decided I'm more valuable dead than alive. Harrington replied, his voice remarkably steady, despite his worsening condition. Probably plans to take over my operations in Silver Creek. He knows too much about my business to leave loose ends. Mason processed this unexpected development swiftly. Your men aren't here to rescue you. They're here to silence you and us along with you. So it would seem, Harrington agreed, wincing as he shifted position on the cot. Which changes our arrangement considerably, doesn't it? Outside, Rawlins called again. You've got 5 minutes to send them out, boss. After that, we're coming in, shooting. Mason exchanged glances with Elena, a wordless communication passing between them. Their fragile alliance with Harrington had just become considerably more complicated and potentially more genuine. What's to stop you from using this as a trick? Nara asked, Harrington's suspicion evident in her voice. You could call your men off now, only to have them ambush us on the trail tomorrow. Because I'm not a fool, Harrington replied, his voice growing weaker. Rawlins wouldn't be making demands unless he'd already decided to eliminate me. He knows too much about my operations, my accounts, He hesitated, then continued with evident reluctance. My ledger. Ledger? Elena repeated, her interest clearly piqued. A calculating look crossed Harrington's face, even through his pain. In my office safe. A record of every transaction, every arrangement, every deal that built Silver Creek. Including, he added with significance, the details of the Northern Valley acquisition and what happened to those who stood in the way. Mason understood immediately. Written evidence of Nahalie's murder, of the raid on the Apache village. And much more, Harrington confirmed. Insurance in case certain parties ever turned against me. But I never anticipated Rawlins would be bold enough to make a move himself. The implications were clear. If they could reach Silver Creek with Harrington alive, they might secure not just his testimony, but documented evidence of his crimes, and possibly the crimes of others who had helped him. 3 minutes, boss! Rawlins shouted from outside, impatience edging into his voice. Mason made his decision. We need to get out of here. All of us. Together. How? Elena asked. They're watching every approach. Not every approach, Mason replied, moving to the center of the small room and kneeling. He ran his fingers along the floorboards until he found what he was looking for, a small metal ring recessed into the wood. This line shack was built during the Apache Wars, has an escape tunnel that leads to a ravine about 200 yards east. Nara's eyebrows rose in surprise. Your people built escape routes into their outposts. The army did, Mason corrected, pulling up the trap door to reveal a dark passage below. Fear of Apache raids was constant in those days. Ironic that we're using it to escape white men now. A faint smile touched Elena's lips. The spirits have a sense of humor, it seems. Get Harrington ready to move, Mason instructed, reaching for a lantern. I'll go first to make sure the tunnel is still passable. The old passage was cramped and musty, thick with cobwebs, and the occasional scurrying sound of disturbed rodents. Mason led the way, the dim light of the lantern casting grotesque shadows on the earthen walls. Behind him came Elena, supporting Harrington, whose condition had deteriorated to the point where he could barely stand. Nara brought up the rear, watching their backs with her rifle at the ready. They had covered perhaps half the distance when a commotion erupted above them, shouts. Then the crack of gunfire. Rollins and his men had grown tired of waiting and were storming the shack. They'll find the tunnel entrance soon enough, Mason warned, quickening his pace despite the low ceiling. We need to reach the exit before they do. The passage gradually sloped upward, the air growing fresher as they neared the exit. Finally, Mason saw what he'd been hoping for, wooden slats overhead, filtering moonlight through narrow gaps. Here, he whispered, passing the lantern to Elena. He braced his shoulders against the trapdoor and pushed, feeling the resistance of years of disuse. With a groan of protest, the door lifted, revealing a star-filled sky above. Mason pulled himself up and out, finding himself exactly where he'd expected, in a shallow ravine overgrown with brush, well concealed from casual observation. He reached back to help the others emerge. Elena came next, then Harrington, who needed to be half lifted through the opening, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. Nara followed, lastly grimacing as her injured leg took her weight. Where to now? Elena asked, her voice barely audible over the distant sounds of Rollins and his men tearing apart the line shack. The horses are gone, Mason observed grimly, noting the empty corral visible in the distance. Rollins must have found them when they arrived. Then we go on foot, Nara stated matter-of-factly, though the prospect was daunting. A wounded man, a woman with an injured leg, and many miles of open prairie between them and Silver Creek. We'll never make it, Harrington muttered, leaning heavily against Elena. Not like this. We have to try, Mason insisted. There's a stage road about 5 miles east. If we can reach it by dawn, we might be able to flag down the morning coach to Silver Creek. And if Rollins finds us before then? Elena asked. Mason's hand tightened on his revolver. Then we make our stand. Better odds than waiting in that shack to be cornered. They set out across the moonlit prairie, moving as quickly and quietly as Harrington's condition and Nara's injury would allow. The night was eerily beautiful, a vast dome of stars overhead, the silver-bathed grassland stretching away in all directions. Under different circumstances, Mason might have appreciated the tranquil majesty of it all. But now every shadow seemed to conceal potential danger, every sound a possible pursuit. After an hour of difficult progress, they paused in the shelter of a small copse of cottonwoods. Harrington's breathing had become labored, his skin burning with fever despite the cool night air. He needs rest, Elena said, easing the merchant to the ground. And his bandages need changing. While Elena tended to Harrington's wound, Mason and Nara kept watch, their backs to the trees, eyes scanning the prairie for any sign of their pursuers. "The eastern sky is beginning to lighten," Nara observed, nodding toward the faint gray band appearing on the horizon. "Dawn will be here soon. And with it better visibility for Rawlins and his men," Mason added grimly. "You could leave me." Harrington's voice came weakly from where he lay against a tree trunk. "Make better time without me slowing you down." Mason turned to look at the merchant, surprised by the suggestion. "And let you die out here numb. You're facing justice in Silver Creek, Harrington. The full weight of what you've done." A strange expression crossed Harrington's fever-flushed face, something almost like respect. "Still the lawman, after all," he murmured, "even without the badge." "The badge was never what made him a lawman," Elena said quietly, as she finished securing a fresh bandage. "It was what he carried inside, what he forgot for a time, but has remembered now." The simple statement, delivered without drama or emphasis, struck Mason with unexpected force. For 15 years he had thought of himself as a failed lawman, a disgraced sheriff who had sold his principles for cash. But perhaps the principles themselves had never truly died, only gone dormant, waiting for the right moment to reassert themselves. "We should move," Nara urged, breaking into Mason's reflections. "The stage road can't be more than 2 miles from here." With renewed determination, they continued their journey as the first blush of dawn spread across the eastern sky. The prairie gradually revealed itself in the growing light, rolling swells of grass, patches of wildflowers, the occasional stunted tree. Beautiful country worth fighting for, worth dying for, if necessary. They had nearly reached the stage road when Nara, who had been scouting slightly ahead, despite her injury, suddenly dropped to a crouch, signaling for the others to do the same. "Riders," she whispered as they joined her in the tall grass, "coming from the north. 3 of them." Mason peered carefully over the grass. 3 mounted men were indeed approaching at a steady trot, following what appeared to be their trail through the dewy grass. "Rawlins," he confirmed grimly, recognizing the scarred face of the lead rider. "They must have found the tunnel exit and picked up our trail." "We'll never outrun them now," Elena observed calmly, though her hand tightened on the revolver at her side. "No," Mason agreed. "But we might outthink them." He scanned their surroundings, assessing options with the practiced eye of a former lawman. The stage road was tantalizingly close, perhaps 500 yards ahead, a rutted trail running east to west across the prairie. Beyond it lay a steeper ravine than the one they had emerged from, offering potential cover. "If we can reach that ravine," Mason indicated with a subtle nod, "we might be able to hold them off until the morning stage comes through." "And if the stage doesn't come?" Nara asked pragmatically. "Then we make our last stand there instead of here," Mason replied. "Better ground, at least." Harrington, who had been silent for some time, suddenly spoke. "Leave me the revolver," he said, his voice stronger than it had been for hours. "I'll delay them. Give you time to reach the ravine." Mason turned to him with surprise. "Why would you do that?" A grim smile touched Harrington's pale lips. "Because Rawlins is going to kill me regardless. I'd rather die taking him with me than waiting for him to put a bullet in my back." His fever-bright eyes held Mason's gaze steadily. "And because I owe you this much, at least." "Owe me," Mason repeated, genuinely confused. "For your father," Harrington said simply. "He was a good man, better than either of us. He deserved better than what I did to him." The admission, so unexpected, so matter-of-fact, left Mason momentarily speechless. After 15 years of running from the truth here, it was delivered in the most unlikely circumstances by the very man responsible. "We're not leaving you behind," Mason said finally, recovering his composure. We all reach Silver Creek, or none of us do." Harrington shook his head weakly. "Noble to the end, but impractical. I'm dying anyway, Mason. The fever's in my blood. I won't last the day." "All the more reason to get you to a doctor," Elena interjected firmly. "Your testimony is too valuable to lose." "My testimony?" Harrington gave a soft, bitter laugh. "The ramblings of a dying murderer. No, my ledger is what matters now. The evidence that can't be questioned or dismissed." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as Rawlins and his men continued their approach. Time was running out. "We go together," Mason insisted, helping Harrington to his feet. "Make for the ravine as quickly and quietly as possible. If they spot us, run for cover. Don't stop. Don't look back." They set out through the tall grass, moving in a half-crouched position to remain below the sight line of the mounted men. Progress was agonizingly slow, each step potentially giving away their position if the grass moved too obviously. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the stage road when a shout went up behind them. "There, in the grass." The quiet morning erupted with the crack of rifle-fire bullets whining overhead and thudding into the ground around them. The pretense of stealth abandoned Mason, urged the others forward at a run, supporting Harrington as best he could while keeping his revolver ready in his free hand. Elena and Nara forged ahead, making for the road with determined strides despite Nara's limp. Behind them, Mason heard the thunder of hooves as Rawlins and his men charged, closing the distance rapidly. "Go!" Mason shouted to the women, turning to face the oncoming riders. He raised his revolver and fired twice in quick succession, not aiming to hit but to force them to veer off or slow their approach. One of the riders swerved sharply, nearly losing his seat. The distraction bought them precious seconds. They reached the stage road just as Rawlins and his men regrouped for another charge. The ravine was just ahead, its steep banks promising shelter from both bullets and sight. "Down there!" Mason directed, helping Harrington toward the edge. The merchant was barely conscious now, his weight a dragging burden as Mason half-carried, half-dragged him forward. Elena and Nara reached the ravine first, sliding down its steep bank in a controlled fall, sending cascades of loose earth and small stones before them. Mason followed with Harrington, the merchant's body, almost dead weight now, as they tumbled down the slope together. They landed roughly at the bottom, Mason taking the brunt of the impact as Harrington collapsed on top of him. For a moment, he lay stunned, the breath knocked from his lungs. Then Elena was there, pulling Harrington aside, helping Mason to his feet. "Are you hurt?" she asked quickly, her dark eyes scanning him for injuries. "Just winded," Mason gasped, retrieving his revolver from where it had fallen. "We need to find cover before they—" His words were cut short by the appearance of Rawlins at the edge of the ravine above them, rifle raised. "End of the line, Calloway," the scarred gunman called down. "Nowhere left to run." Mason pushed Elena behind him, raising his revolver in one fluid motion. Two shots rang out simultaneously, Mason's revolver and Rawlins's rifle speaking as one. Mason felt a searing pain along his left side as Rawlins jerked backward, a dark stain spreading across his chest. For a long moment, Rawlins remained upright, a look of surprise on his scarred face. Then slowly, he toppled forward, tumbling down the ravine to land in a broken heap at the bottom. The remaining two gunmen, seeing their leader fall, retreated from the edge, calling to each other in confused alarm. "Rawlins is down. What do we do now? The hell with this. I ain't dying for a dead man's wages." The sound of retreating hoofbeats told Mason that at least one of them had decided to abandon the pursuit. But they couldn't count on both men leaving. "We need to move," he said, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. The bullet had only grazed him, but the wound was deep enough to be troublesome. Follow the ravine east. It should parallel the stage road. They set off along the bottom of the ravine, Mason and Elena supporting Harrington between them, Nara leading the way despite her injured leg. The ravine deepened as they moved east, its walls rising to 15 or 20 feet in places. The morning sun couldn't reach them here, leaving them in cool shadow as they made their difficult way forward. After what seemed an eternity, but was perhaps half an hour, the distant sound of wheels and hoofbeats reached them, the approaching stage right on schedule. "We need to get up to the road," Mason said, scanning the ravine walls for a climbable section. "There." Nara pointed ahead, where the ravine bank sloped more gradually. "We can ascend there." They increased their pace, Harrington stumbling between Mason and Elena, barely conscious but still moving. As they reached the gentler slope, the sound of the stage grew louder, the rhythmic pounding of hooves, the creak of wheels, the jingle of harness. "Help me with him," Mason instructed Elena, and together they half-carried, half-dragged Harrington up the slope. Nara followed, using her rifle as a makeshift crutch. They emerged onto the stage road just as the coach came into view around a bend. A sturdy Concorde coach, pulled by a 4-horse team, the driver perched high on the box, a shotgun messenger beside him. "Flag them down," Mason told Nara, who had reached the road first. She stepped into the center of the trail, waving her arms above her head. The driver spotted her and hauled back on the reins, bringing the team to a stamping, snorting halt. The shotgun messenger raised his weapon warily, covering the bedraggled group that had appeared so unexpectedly in the road. "What's this, then?" the driver called down his weathered face, suspicious beneath the brim of his hat. "Road agents." "Survivors," Mason replied, stepping forward with Harrington sagging against him. "This man needs a doctor urgently. We need passage to Silver Creek." The shotgun messenger kept his weapon trained on them. "That's Wade Harrington," he said, recognition in his voice. "The merchant from Silver Creek. What happened to him?" "He's been shot." Elena explained, her calm dignity somehow more persuasive than any panicked plea might have been. "As has Mr. Calloway. We are being pursued by dangerous men. Please, we must reach Silver Creek immediately." The driver and the messenger exchanged glances, coming to some silent agreement. "Get in, then," the driver said finally. "But mind that we'll be watching you. Any trouble, and you'll be walking to Silver Creek, those of you still able to walk." They needed no further invitation. Mason and Elena helped Harrington into the coach, where a single startled passenger, a traveling salesman, by the look of his sample case, pressed himself against the far side to make room. Nara climbed in, last settling on the forward-facing seat beside the salesman, her rifle across her knees. As the stage lurched into motion once more, Mason allowed himself to relax slightly for the first time in days. They were on their way to Silver Creek, at last, battered, bloodied, but alive. And with them traveled Wade Harrington, the man whose greed and ruthlessness had set this whole chain of events in motion 15 years earlier. "How long to Silver Creek?" Mason asked the salesman, who was eyeing them all with undisguised curiosity. 3 hours, give or take," the man replied, his gaze lingering on Harrington's ashen face. "Is he going to make it? He doesn't look good." Mason glanced at Harrington, who had lapsed into unconsciousness, his breathing shallow and labored. "He has to," Mason said with quiet determination. "He has a reckoning waiting for him there. Justice 15 years overdue." And the stage rolled on through the morning light, bearing its unlikely company toward Silver Creek, and whatever awaited them, their redemption justice, or perhaps merely the chance to finally set right what had gone so terribly wrong all those years ago. Silver Creek had grown in Mason's absence. What had once been a dusty cluster of buildings along a single main street had expanded into a proper town, multiple cross streets, a church with a tall white steeple, substantial brick buildings interspersed among the wooden structures. Progress, as Harrington would have called it. The stage rolled down Main Street shortly after noon, drawing curious glances from townspeople going about their business. Few would have recognized Mason after 15 years, but Harrington was another matter. Even unconscious and wounded, the merchant was a notable figure in a town he had largely built through his ambition and ruthlessness. They drew up before the Silver Creek Hotel, the finest building in town, another of Harrington's enterprises, Mason suspected. The driver called down from his box, "End of the line, folks, Silver Creek." With the help of several bystanders summoned by the driver's shouts, they managed to get Harrington down from the coach and carried into the hotel lobby. The hotel manager, a portly man with a waxed mustache, nearly fainted at the sight of his employer in such condition. "Mr. Harrington, dear God, what happened to him? Someone fetch Dr. Wilson at once." "And the sheriff," Mason added, still supporting Harrington's weight alongside a helpful stable hand. "We need the sheriff here immediately." The hotel manager's eyes narrowed with sudden suspicion. "Are you responsible for Mr. Harrington's condition, sir?" "No," Mason replied evenly. "But I am responsible for bringing him to justice. My name is Mason Calloway. I was sheriff of Silver Creek 15 years ago." A murmur ran through the growing crowd in the lobby. The name Calloway clearly still carried weight in Silver Creek, even after all these years. "Calloway." The manager repeated his expression, shifting from suspicion to confusion. "But you disappeared after the Apache raid. Everyone thought you were dead." "There was no Apache raid," Mason stated firmly, his voice carrying through the hushed lobby. "That was a lie. A lie I helped create, to my eternal shame. But the truth is coming to light today." Further conversation was forestalled by the arrival of Dr. Wilson, a lean, gray-haired man with spectacles and a serious demeanor. He took charge of Harrington immediately, directing the stable hand and another volunteer to carry the unconscious merchant up to a room. "I need to go with him," Mason insisted. "He's not to be left alone." The doctor gave him a measuring look, noting his blood-stained side. "You need attention yourself, Mr. Calloway. That wound looks nasty." "But it can wait," Mason replied. "Harrington's testimony cannot." Before the doctor could argue further, the hotel doors swung open again to admit a broad-shouldered man wearing a silver star on his vest. Sheriff Daniel Harris, according to the whispers that ran through the crowd. Harris was perhaps 40, with the weathered look of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors. His eyes, a penetrating blue beneath heavy brows, took in the scene with a lawman's practiced assessment. "What's all this about Harrington and justice?" he demanded, his gaze settling on Mason. "Who are you people?" Elena stepped forward, her quiet dignity commanding attention even in her trail-worn condition. "I am Elena Whitefeather. This is my sister Nara. And this," she gestured to Mason, "is Mason Calloway, former sheriff of Silver Creek." Harris's eyebrows rose slightly. "Calloway, the one who left after the Apache raid?" "There was no raid," Nara interjected firmly. "Our brother Nahele Whitefeather was murdered by Wade Harrington. Sheriff Calloway was paid to cover it up. Now he has returned to tell the truth." Harris studied them all for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned to the hotel manager. "Clear the lobby. This is official business now." To Mason and the sisters he added, "You three come with me. We'll continue this discussion in my office." "Harrington," Mason began. "Dr. Wilson will see to him." Harris cut him off. "And I'll post a deputy outside his door. He's not going anywhere." Seeing no alternative, Mason nodded his agreement. With a final glance toward the stairs where Harrington had been carried, he followed Sheriff Harris out into the bright midday sun of Silver Creek. Elena and Nara close behind. The sheriff's office was a solid brick building a few doors down from the hotel. Inside it was much as Mason remembered from his own time as sheriff. A front office with a desk and several chairs, cells in the back, wanted posters on the walls. The only real change was a framed photograph of President Grant that had replaced the one of Lincoln that had hung there in Mason's day. Harris settled behind the desk, gesturing for the others to take seats. Mason remained standing, unwilling to accept even this small courtesy until he knew where the current sheriff stood. "Before we go any further," Mason said, "there's something you should know. The Railroad Commission is in town investigating land claims, correct?" Harris nodded slowly. "They are. Been here about a week looking into property records, treaties, that sort of thing." "Why, because they need to hear what we have to say," Mason replied. "About Harrington, about the Northern Valley, about what really happened 15 years ago." Harris leaned back in his chair, studying Mason with narrowed eyes. "That's a serious claim, Calloway. You're talking about overturning 15 years of accepted history. About accusing the most powerful man in Silver Creek of murder." "I am," Mason acknowledged. "And I have evidence to support it." From inside his vest, Mason withdrew the marriage certificate Elena had shown him back at his cabin, somehow preserved through their flight, the gunfight, and the desperate journey to Silver Creek. "This proves that Jacob Calloway, my father, was legally married to Morning Star, an Apache woman," he explained, laying the document on the desk. "Their son, Nahele Whitefeather, was therefore the legitimate heir to land in the Northern Valley land Harrington has claimed as his own for the past 15 years. Harris studied the document carefully, his lawman's caution evident in his measured movements. "This appears authentic," he admitted finally. "But it's a long way from a marriage certificate to a murder accusation." "But there's more," Elena said, speaking for the first time since entering the office. "In Harrington's office safe there is a ledger, a record of all his dealings, including the murder of Nahel and the attack on our village that followed." Harris's eyebrows rose. "And how would you know what's in Harrington's safe?" "Because he told us," Mason replied. "On the journey here. He's dying, Sheriff. The wound, the fever, he knows he won't survive long, and in his delirium he's been more honest than he ever was in health." Harris considered this, drumming his fingers thoughtfully on the desk. "That's still just hearsay. The word of a delirious man against 15 years of established fact." "Then there's my testimony," Mason said quietly. "I was there when Nahele was killed. I saw Harrington pull the trigger. I took his money to falsify the report, to call it self-defense during a raid that never happened." His voice dropped even lower. "And I've carried the weight of that lie for 15 years. A long silence followed this confession, broken only by the distant sounds of the town outside wagon wheels, on the street voices calling the normal rhythm of a place, unaware that its foundation was about to be shaken. Finally, Harris straightened in his chair. "I'll need to speak with the Railroad Commission representatives and with Judge Emerson. This is beyond my authority alone." "Time is against us," Nara reminded him urgently. "Harrington is dying. His testimony may be our only chance to prove what really happened to our brother, to our mother, to our people." Harris nodded, the decision made. "Wait here. I'll return with the commission representatives and the judge. If what you're saying is true, they need to hear it directly." He paused at the door, fixing Mason with a penetrating look. "For what it's worth, Calloway, I always thought there was something off about that old Apache raid story. Never seemed to fit with what I knew of the Apache in these parts." With that, he was gone, leaving Mason and the sisters alone in the office that had once been Mason's own. "Will he help us?" Elena asked, her calm voice belying the tension evident in her posture. "I think so," Mason replied, easing himself into a chair as the adrenaline of the past days began to ebb, leaving exhaustion and pain in its wake. "Harris strikes me as an honest man, and the presence of the Railroad Commission changes everything. Federal authority trumps local interests. And if Harrington dies before giving his testimony," Nara pressed her practical nature, focusing on the most immediate concern. Mason touched the pocket where he kept the silver bullet. "Then we hope the evidence we have is enough. The marriage certificate, my testimony, and whatever may be in that ledger Harrington mentioned." "If we can access the safe," Elena pointed out. "One problem at a time," Mason advised, closing his eyes briefly against a wave of fatigue. His side throbbed where Rawlins's bullet had grazed him, and the events of the past days were catching up to him rapidly. They sat in silence for some time, each lost in their own thoughts. For Mason, it was a strange feeling to be back in this office, the place where he had once upheld the law, and where 15 years ago he had betrayed everything that badge had represented. The weight of that betrayal felt different now, somehow no less heavy, but more defined. Clearer, as if by facing it directly, he had begun to understand its true dimensions. The door opened, pulling Mason from his reflections. Sheriff Harris entered, accompanied by 3 men, 2 in the formal attire of government officials, the third in the black coat and string tie of a frontier judge. "Mr. Calloway, ladies," Harris began. "This is Judge Emerson," he indicated the older man in judicial attire, "and Commissioners Thornton and Wells of the Federal Railroad Commission." The officials nodded politely, but remained serious, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. "Sheriff Harris has informed us of your allegations against Mr. Harrington," Commissioner Thornton began. He was a tall, spare man with a neatly trimmed beard, his Boston accent marking him as an Easterner. "Given the serious nature of these claims and Mr. Harrington's current condition, we've decided to convene an immediate hearing at his bedside. A deathbed testimony carries particular legal weight." Judge Emerson added, his voice grave. "If Mr. Harrington is indeed dying, his final statements, especially those against his own interests, would be considered exceptionally reliable evidence." "Dr. Wilson confirms that Harrington is failing rapidly," Harris informed them. "If we're to get his testimony, it must be now." Mason rose, ignoring the pain in his side. "Then let's not waste any more time." They proceeded to the hotel as a group, drawing curious stares from townspeople as they passed. News had clearly spread of Harrington's condition, and Mason's return whispers followed them down the street, and faces appeared in windows to watch their progress. At the hotel, they were met by a grim-faced Dr. Wilson descending the stairs. "How is he?" Harris asked immediately. "Conscious but fading," the doctor replied. "The bullet wound itself wasn't fatal, but the infection has spread through his system. He's lucid for now, but I can't say how long that will last." "We need his testimony while he's still able to give it," Commissioner Thornton stated. "Can he speak?" "Yes, though it clearly pains him. Don't expect a lengthy discourse." They ascended to the second floor, where a deputy stood guard outside one of the doors. He nodded to Sheriff Harris and stepped aside to allow the group entry. The room beyond was spacious and well-appointed, the hotel's finest, no doubt reserved for Harrington whenever he required it. The merchant himself lay in a large 4-poster bed, his face ashen against the white pillows, his breathing labored. A local woman, who appeared to be serving as nurse, rose from her chair beside the bed as they entered. "He's been asking for you," she said to Mason, surprising everyone. "Keeps mentioning a sheriff." Mason approached the bed, the others hanging back slightly, to give him room. Harrington's eyes were closed, but they fluttered open at Mason's approach. Recognition flickered in those fever-bright orbs. Calloway. He whispered, his voice a mere shadow of the commanding tone it had once possessed. You made it. We did, Mason confirmed, drawing a chair close to the bed. All of us. The White Feather sisters. The Silver Bullet. The truth. Ghost of Harrington's old smile touched his bloodless lips. The truth. What a strange thing to pursue, after running from it for so long. Judge Emerson stepped forward. Mr. Harrington, I am Judge Emerson of the Territorial Court. With me are representatives of the Federal Railroad Commission. We are here to take your statement regarding events of 15 years ago concerning the death of Nahili Whitefeather and subsequent land claims in the Northern Valley. Harrington's gaze moved to the judge, then to the commissioners, a flicker of his old calculation visible despite his weakened state. A formal inquest at my deathbed, how appropriate. You are not required to speak, the judge continued, but I must advise you that any statement you make will be considered testimony under oath. Under oath? Harrington repeated, a strange irony in his tone. As if that matters now, with St. Peter's ledger awaiting me. His eyes returned to Mason. Your ledger too, Calloway. We both have accounts to settle. We do, Mason agreed quietly. Starting now. Harrington closed his eyes briefly, gathering what strength remained to him. When he spoke again, his voice was clearer, more deliberate, as if he were dictating a final message for posterity. 15 years ago, I killed Nahili Whitefeather, shot him with a silver bullet from my custom Colt when he threatened to expose my cattle-rustling operation on Apache land. He paused, drawing a labored breath. I then paid Sheriff Mason Calloway $1,000 to rule the death as self-defense during an alleged Apache raid. There was no raid. It was cold-blooded murder. The admission delivered so matter-of-factly sent a ripple of reaction through the room. Judge Emerson began taking notes, while the commissioners exchanged glances of surprise at such a direct confession. And the attack on the Apache village that followed? Elena asked, stepping closer to the bed. The attack that killed our mother and 7 others. Harrington's eyes moved to her recognition dawning slowly. The elder Whitefeather's sister. Yes, I remember now. I ordered that attack to silence any who might know about the marriage certificate, the document proving Nahili's claim to the Northern Valley through his father, Jacob Calloway. You knew about the marriage, Mason asked, leaning forward. I discovered it shortly before Nahili's death. Harrington confirmed each word clearly, costing him effort. Your father, Jacob Calloway, had filed the certificate with the Territorial Court in Santa Fe. When the clerk there mentioned a white surveyor marrying an Apache woman, I paid attention. The implications were inconvenient for my plans. So you had my father killed too, Mason said, the words more statement than question. The hunting accident 7 years earlier. Harrington's eyes met Mason's, a strange mixture of defiance and resignation in them. Jacob Calloway was going to reclaim his Apache family, going to use his government connections to enforce the treaty rights to the Northern Valley. I couldn't allow that. His voice dropped even lower. One bullet, from a ridge above where he was checking survey markers. He never knew what hit him. Mason felt the weight of confirmation settle over him, a suspicion long held now verified in the coldest terms. His father had been murdered for the same reason as Nahili. He stood in the way of Harrington's ambitions. In my office safe, Harrington continued, his voice growing weaker. There is a red leather ledger. It contains records of everything, the payments to witnesses to disappear after Jacob's death, the bribe to Sheriff Calloway, the money paid to the men who attacked the Apache village. Every transaction, every deal that built Silver Creek on stolen land, and spilled blood. The combination to your safe, Mr. Harrington? Commissioner Thornton prompted, pen poised above his notebook. 18 right, 32 left, 7 right. Harrington's eyes drifted to the ceiling, his expression distant. All those years building something lasting, something permanent. And now it crumbles like sand. Not Silver Creek, Mason said quietly. The town will survive. It just won't be built on lies anymore. Harrington's gaze returned to Mason, a spark of his old intensity briefly rekindling. You know, Calloway, in a strange way, I'm glad it was you who brought me down. There's a certain symmetry to it. The man I corrupted becoming the instrument of justice. Not me alone, Mason corrected, glancing toward Elena and Nara. The truth has many defenders. The truth, Harrington whispered, his eyes beginning to glaze. So inconvenient. So final. His breathing grew more labored, his next words barely audible. In the end, it finds us all. Wilson stepped forward, checking Harrington's pulse. He's fading rapidly. If there are any final questions, they should be asked now. Judge Emerson looked to Mason and the Whitefeather sisters. Is there anything else you need from Mr. Harrington's testimony? Mason glanced at Elena, who nodded slightly. There was one last matter to address. The Northern Valley, Mason said, leaning close to Harrington. You admit it rightfully belongs to the Apache people, and to Nahile's heirs specifically. Harrington's eyes focused with effort. Yes, he whispered. By treaty and by inheritance through Jacob Calloway, I stole it. Every acre. It was enough. Judge Emerson noted the admission, then stepped back. I believe we have what we need. Dr. Wilson moved to administer something for Harrington's pain, but the merchant weakly waved him away. Let it come, he murmured. I've outrun judgment long enough. His eyes sought Mason one last time, a strange clarity in them despite the approaching end. Remember this, Calloway. A man's life is measured not by what he builds, but by what he leaves behind. A ghost of his old sardonic smile touched his lips. I leave. Silver Creek. What will you leave? Before Mason could respond, Harrington's eyes drifted closed. His breathing continued shallow and labored, but it was clear he had said all he would ever say in this world. Quietly, respectfully, they filed out of the room, leaving Dr. Wilson and the nurse to attend to their patient in his final hours. In the hallway, Judge Emerson turned to the group, his expression grave but determined. I believe we have heard sufficient evidence to warrant immediate action, he stated formally. Commissioner Thornton, would you and Commissioner Wells accompany Sheriff Harris to Mr. Harrington's office to retrieve the ledger mentioned in his testimony? Of course, Your Honor, Thornton agreed. Assuming the combination provided is correct, we should have the document within the hour. Harris nodded his agreement. I know where Harrington's office is. We'll go immediately. Excellent, the judge continued. I will remain at the hotel to formalize Mr. Harrington's deathbed testimony. Mr. Calloway, ladies, I would ask that you remain available for further questions as we proceed. We're not going anywhere, Mason assured him, his hand unconsciously moving to the wound in his side, which had begun to throb more insistently. You need medical attention, Mr. Calloway, Judge Emerson observed, noting the gesture. I suggest you avail yourself of it while we secure the additional evidence. Mason was about to object when Elena laid a gentle hand on his arm. The judge is right, she said quietly. You've done your part for now. Let Dr. Wilson tend to your wound when he's finished with Harrington. Recognizing the wisdom in her words, Mason nodded his agreement. "I'll be at the hotel if you need me." As the commissioners and Sheriff Harris departed for Harrington's office, Mason found himself alone with Elena and Nara in the hotel corridor. For a moment, none of them spoke, the weight of what had just transpired settling over them like a mantle. "It's really happening," Nara said, finally a note of wonder in her voice. "After 15 years. Justice for Nahele. For our mother, for all our people." "Justice," Mason echoed the word, still strange on his tongue after so many years of avoiding it. "And truth. And healing," Elena added softly. "For the land. For the people. For you, Mason Calloway." He met her dark eyes, seeing in them not accusation for his past failures, but recognition of his present standing. "I don't know if there's healing for what I did," he admitted, "but there's a chance to make it right." "That's something." "It's everything," Elena corrected gently. "The past cannot be changed, but the future is not yet written. Nahele saw this day in his vision. He knew you would return when the great storm came." Mason thought of the storm that had brought these women to his door just days ago, a lifetime ago it seemed now. Had Nahele truly foreseen it all? The Apache believed in such visions his father had told him. Perhaps there was more wisdom in their beliefs than he had allowed himself to consider. "What happens now?" Nara asked, her practical nature asserting itself. "When the land is returned to our people." "That will be for the tribal council to decide," Elena replied. "But I believe they will need someone who understands both worlds, someone who can speak for the Apache when decisions are made about the land, someone with the blood of both peoples in his veins." Her gaze rested meaningfully on Mason, the implication clear. He shook his head, slightly uncertain. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for such a role," he began. "After what I did, after what you did, you returned to make it right," Elena interrupted. "That counts for more than you know, Mason Calloway. Our people respect those who acknowledge their failings and seek to correct them." Before Mason could respond, a young deputy appeared at the end of the corridor, approaching with quick steps. "Mr. Calloway, Sheriff Harris sent me to find you. They've opened the safe and found the ledger. The judge requests your presence at the Commission's temporary offices immediately." The next few hours passed in a blur of testimony and documentation. The ledger proved to be everything Harrington had claimed, a meticulous record of bribes, threats, murders, and land grabs spanning 15 years. Names of territorial officials who had taken money to look the other way. Detailed accounts of the plot against Nahele and the subsequent attack on the Apache village. Even the cold calculation of Jacob Calloway's murder recorded as a necessary expenditure to secure Northern Valley rights. Mason provided his own testimony, holding nothing back, neither Harrington's crimes nor his own complicity in covering them up. The commissioners and Judge Emerson listened gravely, taking extensive notes and occasionally asking questions to clarify specific points. By evening, preliminary findings had been drafted. The Northern Valley would be returned to the Apache tribe with specific provisions for the descendants of Nahele Whitefeather. Harrington's other holdings would be reviewed for legitimacy, with those acquired through fraud or coercion subject to potential restitution claims. And a formal acknowledgement would be issued regarding the false narrative of the Apache raid 15 years earlier, clearing the tribe of any wrongdoing. As the session concluded, Commissioner Thornton approached Mason, who sat exhausted but satisfied in a chair by the window. "There's one more matter to address, Mr. Calloway," the commissioner said, his formal manner softened by evident respect. "The matter of your own legal culpability in these events." Mason nodded, having expected this. "I'm prepared to face whatever consequences The law demands, Commissioner. I don't seek clemency for my actions." Thornton exchanged glances with Judge Emerson, who had joined them. "Under normal circumstances, your admission of accepting a bribe to falsify official reports would indeed carry serious penalties," the judge confirmed. "However, these are not normal circumstances. Your voluntary return to expose the truth at considerable personal risk carries significant weight in mitigation. And furthermore," Commissioner Thornton added, "there is the matter of your unique position to assist in the transition of the Northern Valley back to Apache stewardship. As someone with connections to both communities, your insights would be invaluable." Mason looked between the two men, understanding dawning. "Are you offering me some kind of official role in this? The Commission is empowered to appoint a liaison between the territorial government and the Apache tribe," Thornton confirmed. "Someone to oversee the implementation of the treaty rights we're restoring and to ensure fair treatment going forward. Your name has been suggested for this position." "By whom?" Mason asked, genuinely surprised. "By Elena Whitefeather," Judge Emerson replied with a small smile. "She spoke quite convincingly of your qualifications during a private consultation earlier this afternoon. The Tribal Council has apparently already given their provisional approval." Mason was momentarily speechless. After 15 years of exile and shame, to be offered a position of responsibility of trust was more than he had ever expected. "I would need time to consider this," he managed finally. "Of course," Thornton nodded. "But not too much time, Mr. Calloway. The work of justice, once begun, tends to move at its own pace." As the officials moved away to discuss other matters, Mason found himself alone with his thoughts. Through the window he could see Silver Creek in the gathering twilight lights, appearing in windows, people moving along the boardwalks, the normal rhythm of a town continuing despite the earthquakes of revelation that had shaken its foundations today. Wade Harrington had died an hour earlier, slipping away without regaining consciousness after his deathbed testimony. The man who had built Silver Creek through ambition, ruthlessness, and murder was gone. But the town remained. It would survive this reckoning, Mason believed, might even become something better, something more, just for having faced the truth of its origins. A soft step behind him announced Elena's presence before she spoke. "The commissioners have told you of their offer." Mason turned to face her, noting how the lamplight softened her features, emphasizing the quiet strength that seemed her most essential quality. "They have. I'm still processing it." "It is a significant responsibility," Elena acknowledged. "A bridge between two worlds." "Worlds I've betrayed in different ways," Mason reminded her. "The white man's law, which I corrupted for money. The Apache people, whose murder I helped cover up." "And yet worlds you now seek to reconcile," she countered. "The past cannot be erased, Mason Calloway, but the future is shaped by the choices we make today." He studied her thoughtfully. "You recommended me for this position. Why?" "Because you understand the cost of silence," Elena replied simply. "And the power of truth. Because you have walked in darkness and found your way back to the light. Such a journey leaves wisdom in its wake if one is humble enough to recognize it." "And you believe I have that wisdom?" Mason asked, skepticism evident in his tone. A small smile touched Elena's lips. "I believe you have the capacity for it. The rest will come with time and experience." Before Mason could respond, Sheriff Harris appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled. "Calloway, we may have a problem. One of Harrington's former men just rode in from the east. Says there's a group of ranchers gathering at the Henderson place talking about taking matters into their own hands once they heard what happened today." Mason straightened, instantly alert. "What kind of numbers are we looking at? 20, maybe 30 men, according to our informant, Harris replied grimly, armed and angry. They stand to lose significant investments if the Northern Valley reverts to Apache control. Henderson's been stirring them up, telling them the government's stealing their future. Vigilante justice, Mason murmured, the last resort of those who fear actual justice. I've sent deputies to monitor the situation, Harris continued. But if they decide to ride into town, or worse, target the Apache settlement to the north, then we need to be prepared, Mason finished for him. He turned to Elena. Your people should be warned. How quickly can a message reach the settlement? Nara has already departed, Elena informed him calmly. As soon as we heard rumors of unrest, the tribal council will be prepared by nightfall. Mason nodded, unsurprised by her foresight. Good, but that still leaves the town vulnerable. These men have legitimate grievances. They purchased land and rights from Harrington in good faith, not knowing his claims were fraudulent. Their grievances may be legitimate, but violence is not the answer, Sheriff Harris stated firmly. I won't have bloodshed in my town. Nor should there be, Commissioner Thornton interjected, having overheard the conversation. The Commission's findings include provisions for fair compensation to innocent third parties who purchased land in good faith. These men need to understand that their interests will be protected through legal channels. They need to hear that from someone they might believe, Mason suggested. Someone who understands their position but can also explain the Commission's intentions. Harris and Thornton both looked at him, the same thought clearly occurring to them simultaneously. You're suggesting yourself, Harris stated. I am, Mason confirmed. I was one of them once, a rancher trying to build something on this frontier. I understand their fears. And now I also understand the bigger picture the Commission is trying to address. Commissioner Thornton nodded slowly. It would be a fitting first act in your new role as liaison, assuming you're accepting the position. Mason hesitated only briefly before nodding. I am, on one condition. Which is, Thornton prompted, that it be made clear I speak with the authority of both the Commission and the Apache Tribal Council, Mason replied, glancing at Elena, who inclined her head in agreement. These men need to understand this isn't about choosing sides. It's about finding a just path forward for everyone. Agreed, Thornton stated promptly. Sheriff Harris, can you provide Mr. Calloway with an escort to this gathering? I'll do better than that, Harris replied. I'll go with him myself. 2 lawmen might carry more weight than one. As preparations were made for the journey to the Henderson Ranch, Mason found himself once again checking his revolver out of long habit. Elena watched him, a subtle question in her dark eyes. Is this wise? She asked quietly. These men may not be receptive to reason, especially from someone they might view as having betrayed their interests. Probably not wise, Mason acknowledged with a grim smile, but necessary. I helped create this situation 15 years ago when I chose the easy path instead of the right one. I won't make that mistake again. Elena studied him for a long moment, then reached into a small pouch at her waist. She withdrew something that gleamed dully in the lamplight, a polished stone pendant on a leather cord. This belonged to Naheli, she said, holding it out to him. A protective stone given to him by our mother. He was wearing it when he died. I retrieved it afterward. She placed it in Mason's palm, closing his fingers around it. Carry it tonight. Let it remind you that you do not walk alone. The simple gesture, offered without ceremony, but with evident meaning, touched Mason more deeply than he had expected. He slipped the cord over his head, feeling the weight of the stone settle against his chest. Thank you, he said simply. Sheriff Harris appeared in the doorway, his horse and Mason's already saddled and waiting outside. "It's time, Calloway. If we're going to reach Henderson's before those men work themselves into something foolish, we need to ride now." With a final nod to Elena, Mason followed Harris out into the night. Silver Creek lay quiet around them, most citizens having retreated to their homes as news of possible trouble spread. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear night sky, the same stars that had guided travelers across these lands for countless generations. As they rode out of town, Mason found himself touching the stone pendant at his chest. For 15 years he had carried the weight of his betrayal like a physical burden. Now, riding toward an uncertain confrontation, he felt strangely lighter. Not free of responsibility, never that, but somehow clearer about his purpose, about the path that had led him here and the one that stretched before him. Whatever happened at the Henderson Ranch tonight, Mason Calloway was no longer running from the truth. He was riding toward it, ready at last to face whatever consequences it might bring. The journey to Henderson's ranch took just over an hour, the nearly full moon providing ample light for the riders to follow the well-worn trail. As they approached, the glow of a large bonfire became visible in the ranch yard, around which dark figures moved in restless congregation. "Looks like about 25 men," Sheriff Harris observed in a low voice as they drew rein on a small rise overlooking the ranch. "Most from the Northern Valley properties, judging by the horses I recognize." Mason nodded, studying the scene. "Armed? Sidearms for certain. Probably rifles in saddle scabbards. These aren't gunmen looking for trouble, Calloway. They're ranchers and farmers protecting what they see as rightfully theirs." "I understand that better than most," Mason replied quietly. "Let's hope they're willing to listen." They rode down toward the ranch at a steady walk, making no attempt to conceal their approach. A lookout spotted them when they were still 100 yards out, calling an alarm that brought several men to the edge of the firelight, hands hovering near holstered weapons. "That's far enough," called a voice Mason recognized as belonging to Frank Henderson, the ranch owner. "Identify yourselves." "Sheriff Daniel Harris," Harris called back calmly. "And Mason Calloway, representing the Federal Railroad Commission and the Apache Tribal Council." A murmur ran through the gathered men at Mason's name. Clearly, word of his return and the day's revelations had spread quickly throughout the territory. "Come ahead, Sheriff," Henderson called after a brief consultation with those nearest him. "But keep your hands visible." They advanced into the circle of firelight, where some 25 men had gathered. Ranchers, farmers, and a few townsmen with interests in the Northern Valley properties. Their expressions ranged from suspicious to openly hostile, though none made any threatening moves as Harris and Mason dismounted. Frank Henderson stepped forward, a burly man in his 50s with a silver-streaked beard and the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working the land. "Sheriff," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "Calloway." "Frank," Harris returned evenly. "Quite a gathering you've got here." "Just neighbors discussing mutual concerns," Henderson replied, though the assembled weapons and the tension in the air belied the innocuous description. Word travels fast when the government decides to steal 15 years of honest work overnight. Mason stepped forward, deliberately keeping his hands away from his weapon. "No one's looking to steal anything, Frank. That's why we're here, to explain what's actually happening and to listen to your concerns." "Explain?" A bitter laugh came from one of the men near the fire. "What's to explain? The Apache are getting the valley, and we're getting pushed off land we paid good money for. Seems pretty clear to me." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering, but Mason held his ground. "If that's what you've heard wrong. The Commission's findings are more nuanced than that, and they specifically provide for the interests of those who purchased land in good faith." "What does that mean exactly?" Henderson demanded. though Mason noted a flicker of interest beneath the man's belligerent tone. "It means," Mason explained, "that those who legitimately purchased land or rights from Harrington, not knowing his claims were fraudulent, will be eligible for fair compensation or equivalent land grants elsewhere in the territory." This statement caused a stir among the gathered men, with several exchanging surprised glances. "That's not what we heard," someone called from the back of the group. "Henderson said we'd be left with nothing, that the government was siding with the Indians, and to hell with the white settlers." Mason's gaze moved to Henderson, whose expression had grown guarded. "Is that what you told them, Frank? Because, if so, you weren't working with complete information." Henderson shifted uncomfortably, the fire casting dramatic shadows across his face. "I told them what seemed obvious from the rumors coming out of town. Harrington dead, the Apache making land claims, the Railroad Commission talking about treaty rights. And you decided to gather armed men rather than seeking clarification from official sources," Sheriff Harris observed dryly. "Not your wisest move, Frank." "We have a right to protect what's ours," Henderson insisted, though with noticeably less conviction. "You do," Mason agreed. "But first, you need to understand exactly what is yours, according to the law, and what isn't." Over the next hour, Mason explained the Commission's findings in detail: the fraudulent nature of Harrington's original land claims, the provisions for compensating innocent purchasers, the plans for gradual and orderly transition rather than sudden dispossession. Sheriff Harris occasionally interjected to clarify legal points, his steady presence adding authority to the discussion. Gradually, the tension in the gathering began to ease, as the men realized that their worst fears were unfounded. They wouldn't be left destitute or homeless. Their investments, while affected, would not be completely lost. There was a path forward that recognized both the historical injustice done to the Apache and the innocent involvement of those who had come later. "So this liaison position you're taking," Henderson said finally, after most of the specific concerns had been addressed. "You'll be representing our interests too, not just the Apache." "I'll be representing justice and workable solutions," Mason replied carefully. "I can't promise that everyone will get exactly what they want, but I can promise that everyone will be heard and that decisions will be made with all interests in mind." Henderson considered this, then extended his hand. "That's fair enough, Calloway. More than fair, considering the circumstances." As Mason clasped his hand, Henderson added more quietly, "For what it's worth, there were always rumors about how Harrington acquired that valley. Not everyone was surprised by what came out today. Yet you were ready to lead armed men against the Commission's findings," Mason observed. A rueful expression crossed Henderson's weathered face. "Fear makes men do foolish things, Calloway. You should know that better than most." The simple statement, delivered without malice, struck Mason with its truth. Fear had indeed driven his own worst decisions: fear of Harrington, fear of poverty, fear of standing alone against power. But he had found his way past that fear, and perhaps these men could too. "There's a meeting at the courthouse tomorrow morning," Mason informed the gathering as he and Harris prepared to depart. 10 o'clock. The commissioners will be there to register legitimate claims and begin the compensation process. I suggest you all attend with clear heads and without sidearms." This drew a ripple of laughter from the men, the tension of the evening finally broken. As Mason and Harris mounted their horses, several of the ranchers approached to shake their hands, the threatened violence of earlier completely dissipated. "Well handled," Harris commented as they rode away from the ranch, the bonfire dwindling behind them. "I wasn't sure they'd listen, especially to you, given your history." "Maybe that's why they did listen," Mason suggested. "A man who's admitted his mistakes might be more credible than one who claims he's never made any." They rode in companionable silence for a time, the moonlight casting their shadows long across the trail ahead. Finally, Harris spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "You know, when I took this badge 5 years ago, old Sheriff Taylor, the one who replaced you, told me Silver Creek was built on secrets, said there were things best left buried for the good of the town." He glanced at Mason. "I never much liked that idea. A town like a man should be able to face its own truth and still stand tall." "Silver Creek will survive this," Mason assured him. "Might even be stronger for it. Truth has a way of clearing the ground for something better to grow." As they crested the final rise before town, Silver Creek lay spread before them, a cluster of lamp-lit windows in the vast darkness of the prairie. Mason reined in for a moment, taking in the sight. This place that had haunted his dreams for 15 years no longer seemed like the site of his greatest shame. Instead, it felt like somewhere he might in time belong again. The stone pendant Elena had given him rested warm against his chest, a tangible connection to Nahala, to the Apache people, to a heritage he had denied for too long. In accepting this connection, Mason realized he had not lost something, but gained it, a fuller understanding of himself and his place in the complex tapestry of this frontier. "Coming Calloway," Harris called, having ridden a few paces ahead. "Yes," Mason replied, urging his horse forward once more. "I'm coming home." The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity as the Commission's findings were implemented. The courthouse became the center of operations, with a steady stream of landowners, ranchers, and townspeople coming to register claims, review documents, and learn what the new reality meant for their particular circumstances. Mason found himself at the heart of this process, his unique position as liaison between the Commission, the territorial government, and the Apache Tribal Council, making him essential to nearly every discussion. It was exhausting work, but deeply satisfying. The first time in 15 years he had felt truly useful, truly engaged in something larger than his own survival. Elena and the tribal elders from the Apache settlement came to town on the third day, bringing with them their own records and oral histories of the Northern Valley's boundaries and usage. The meeting between these elders and the Commission representatives was a historic moment, perhaps the first time in territorial history that Apache claims were being given equal weight to white settlers' documentation. In the midst of these formal proceedings, Mason found moments for personal reconciliation as well. He visited the territorial cemetery where Nahala Whitefeather had been buried in an unmarked grave 15 years earlier, part of the fiction that he had died during a raid rather than by Harrington's deliberate murder. With Elena's guidance and the assistance of several Apache men who had journeyed to town with the tribal council, a proper marker was erected and a traditional ceremony performed to honor Nahala's spirit. During this ceremony, Mason placed the tarnished sheriff's badge and the silver bullet on Nahala's grave, symbols of both his failure and his eventual return to truth. As the Apache singers raised their voices in a haunting melody that seemed to catch the very wind itself, Mason felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a burden he had carried for so long he had almost forgotten what it was like to stand straight and unburdened. "He would be pleased," Elena said softly, as they left the cemetery together. "Not just with the justice, but with your transformation." Nahala believed strongly in the possibility of change, in the capacity of the human spirit to find its true path, even after wandering far from it. "I'm still finding that path," Mason admitted. "Still learning what it means to honor both sides of my heritage." "As are we all," Elena replied with a gentle smile. "The path is not a single line, but a web of connections, each strengthening the others. Your father understood this. So did Nahala. Now you begin to understand it too." A week after Harrington's death, the Commission completed its formal findings and prepared to depart for the territorial capital. The Northern Valley had been officially recognized as Apache land, under the original treaties with specific provisions for the Whitefeather family as legitimate heirs through Jacob Calloway's marriage to Morning Star. Affected settlers had been registered for fair compensation or alternative land grants, with Mason appointed as the permanent liaison to oversee the transition and mediate any disputes that might arise. On their final evening in Silver Creek, Commissioners Thornton and Wells invited Mason to join them for dinner at the hotel. As they dined, Thornton raised a question that had clearly been on his mind. "I've been wondering, Mr. Calloway, what you intend to do with your own ranch. Will you maintain it while serving in your liaison capacity?" Mason shook his head. "I've decided to sell it. Sheriff Harris knows a young couple looking to establish themselves good people who'll treat the land well." "And the proceeds?" Wells inquired, his Boston manners slightly at odds with the frontier setting. A small smile touched Mason's lips. "I'm donating them to establish a school near the Apache settlement. A place where children from both communities can learn together Apache language and culture alongside the standard territorial curriculum." Both commissioners looked surprised, but pleasantly so. "A fitting legacy," Thornton observed, "building bridges rather than walls between the communities." "It seems the least I can do," Mason replied simply. "The money that built that ranch came from Harrington blood money for my silence. It feels right to use it now for something that might help heal old wounds." The conversation turned to other matters, but later that evening, as Mason walked alone through the quiet streets of Silver Creek, he found himself reflecting on Thornton's words. Legacy. What would his be when all was said and done? Not the shame and silence of the past 15 years, he hoped, but something more constructive, something that acknowledged both the harm done and the possibilities for repair and renewal. His wandering brought him to the steps of the Silver Creek Church, its white steeple gleaming in the moonlight. On impulse, he climbed the steps and entered the empty sanctuary, the smell of wood polish and candle wax welcoming him into the hushed interior. Mason had never been particularly religious, but tonight, sitting alone in a back pew of the silent church, he felt a need for contemplation that went beyond ordinary thought. His father, for all his embrace of Apache ways, had maintained his own Christian faith, finding no contradiction between respecting both spiritual traditions. "Seeking answers. Mason Calloway," came a quiet voice from the shadows. Mason turned startled to find Elena standing in the side aisle, her dark figure almost merged with the shadows of the church. "I didn't know you were here," he said, making room for her on the pew. "I often seek quiet places for reflection," she explained, sitting beside him. "Even in traditions not my own. The building matters less than the silence it contains." They sat together without speaking for several minutes, the comfortable silence of those who no longer need constant words to communicate. "I've been thinking about what happens next," Mason finally said. "About building something lasting out of all this upheaval." Elena nodded understanding in her dark eyes. "The most enduring structures are often built on ground that has been cleared by fire or flood. The old must sometimes be swept away before the new can."